Where am I going? The committee will come to order. Thank you for your patience, Mr. Secretary. We were just working out how we are going to proceed today. We have a classified briefing that's extremely important that will be called about 1:30. And so we're not sure how long it's going to go. If it goes beyond an hour, we will come back and we will relieve you if you are prepared to go. We will not ask you to stay beyond 1 hour. If it is over in 1 hour, we'll come back and we'll continue with the hearing. Otherwise, we will let you know and you can make a decision. Is that understood by everybody? Thank you very much. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. Today's hearing is entitled Housing in America, Oversight of the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development. I now recognize myself for 4 minutes to give an opening statement. Today, this committee convenes for a hearing to conduct oversight over the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development. Our sole witness is Dr. Benjamin Carson, the Trump administration's HUD secretary. I am very concerned about Secretary Carson's actions leading HUD. Specifically, under his leadership, HUD has put forth an outrageous plan that would triple rent for the lowest income households and put 1.7 million Americans at risk of eviction and homelessness at a time we were in the midst of a national homelessness and housing affordability crisis. His most recent proposed budget would cut HUD funding by 18%. That budget proposal includes the elimination of new funding for the National Housing Trust Fund and Capital Magnet Fund, essential programs that are in place to increase the supply of affordable housing. As I've said before, what we need is a real investment in affordable housing programs, not senseless budget cuts. Under Secretary Carson's leadership, HUD has diminished and compromised fair housing protections. Secretary Carson has halted the implementation of HUD's affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, which is an important rule finalized by the Obama administration that provides communities with greater clarity on how to help break down residential segregation and barriers to fair housing opportunity. I'm also concerned by the reports about delays in disaster recovery funds reaching Puerto Rico and delays in a HUD office of the Inspector General. Inquiry into the matter due to a lack of timely cooperation by HUD. I was also very troubled by Secretary Carson's recent cruel proposal to terminate housing benefits for families that include individuals with mixed immigration statuses. Of course, existing law prevents federal housing programs from subsidizing individuals with ineligible immigration status. Prorated rental assistance allows mixed immigration status families to remain together while exclusively subsidizing only those family members with eligible status. The Trump administration proposal puts mixed status families at risk of being evicted, separated, and left homeless. Secretary Carson, across the board, these actions are inconsistent with HUD's mission. Instead of helping the hardworking Americans and vulnerable families, the agency is in place to serve. The Trump administration is actively causing harm, striving to make housing less available, affordable, and fair. Today, you will face some tough questions about your leadership decisions and mismanagement of the agency. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the committee, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. McHenry, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Waters. Thank you, Secretary Carson. Thank you for your service and to the American people and in our government. So HUD was created more than 50 years ago by President Lyndon Johnson, who intended the new agency to be a major tool in combating poverty, rebuilding our cities, and making housing more affordable for all. To that end, HUD is involved in several programs, including federal public and Indian housing efforts, community planning and development initiatives, fair housing and equal opportunity enforcement, FHA mortgage insurance, Ginnie Mae securitization of federally guaranteed mortgages, and more recently, disaster recovery efforts. Yet HUD also finds itself at a crossroads. It must meet the 21st century expectations of the American people in a 20th century framework with 19th century technology. This is not a recipe for success. Instead of looking for easy answers to complex problems, Secretary Carson did what Dr. Carson has done countless times before while he was a surgeon. He rolled up his sleeves and set to work to find things no matter how big the challenge. And there have been challenges. He has implemented reforms to reduce fraud and abuse in how we finance mortgages through FHA and Ginnie Mae. He reversed a decade-long trend by once again hiring a chief financial officer for HUD to protect taxpayers and combat wasteful spending. HUD also stood up for housing when it filed suit in 2018 against the New York City Housing Authority for routinely and flagrantly failing to uphold its legal obligations under the Fair Housing Act of 1937. Until HUD stepped in, the New York City Housing Authority put real people in harm's way, serious harm's way, and then repeatedly misled HUD about its wrongdoings. He also took the fight against housing discrimination into the 21st century by scrutinizing digital ads that may have violated the Fair Housing Act and were modern-day efforts at redlining. Additionally, Secretary Carson has worked to promote the public-private partnership model of advancing social and economic prosperity for all Americans by chairing the Interagency White House Opportunity and Revitalization Council, which works to help distressed communities stimulate development and entrepreneurship through new tools like opportunity zones. Opportunity zones are a welcome addition in our tax code and are having an impact in our communities, but will have a much stronger impact in the coming decades. I applaud Secretary Carson for his efforts to bring much-needed reform to the agency, including modernizing old programs, updating regulation, knocking down barriers to individual and local investment as well. Last week, I sent a letter to Secretary Carson urging a swift movement on several pending regulations. Finalizing new rules that reflect modern realities on topics like affirmatively furthering fair housing and disparate impact will go a long way to helping local communities and consumers. I welcome you finalizing those rules in a timely manner. The path to reform isn't always smooth. I think there are reasonable questions regarding how HUD communicates information and how it handled the unprecedented amount of disaster aid it administers. I look forward to hearing the Secretary's response to those questions in particular. Like many other federal programs, we must recognize that housing in the 21st century is a partnership between federal, state, and local governments, one that needs to be collaborative for it to be successful. We must do our part to achieve bipartisan results, to help those that are homeless get into sustainable housing. We must do our part to modernize the federal footprint with changes in law, and the executive branch must do its part in changes to regulation to meet these challenges. As Secretary Carson has said, we must leverage outside public and private investment in addition to federal funds to meet our housing challenges. I concur. And I expect to modernize HUD to lead the way towards the future. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the chair of the Subcommittee on Housing, Community Development, and Insurance, Mr. Clay, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And as we mark the 51-year passage of the Fair Housing Act, there is still much work to be done to promote and ensure fair housing in America. In fact, as I noted in a recent conversation, residents in my district in the community of Wellston, Missouri, are facing the prospect of dislocation and upheaval. Though we have had conversations, I want to make it clear for the record that I fully expect HUD to follow through on any and all commitments made and work with my staff and me to ensure that the residents have access to affordable housing. And I hope that we can find a solution, such as a grand family development or usage of Section 202 housing. And I stand at the ready to work with HUD. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. I want to welcome to the committee our witness, Dr. Benjamin S. Carson, Sr., the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. He has served in his current position since 2017. Mr. Carson has testified before the committee on previous occasions, and I do not believe he needs further introduction. Without objection, your written statement will be made a part of the record. Secretary Carson, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your oral testimony.
Ranking Member McHenry, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss housing in America. Let me begin with fair housing. In so many ways, we can't consider our housing markets healthy unless those markets are also fair. In today's interconnected electronic world, discrimination can take less obvious forms. That's why I initiated an investigation into Facebook and 2 months ago charged Facebook with violating the Fair Housing Act by using its social media platform to encourage, enable, and cause housing discrimination. Using a computer to limit a person's housing choices is just as discriminatory as slamming a door in someone's face. This year, HUD is also placing a special focus on protecting the rights of individuals to feel safe and secure in their homes, free from sexual harassment. Turning to housing finance, HUD oversees $1.4 trillion in Federal Housing Administration mortgage insurance and more than $2 trillion in Ginnie Mae mortgage-backed securities. Considering HUD's critical role in supporting affordable and sustainable mortgage finance, it is essential that housing finance reform efforts take a comprehensive view of the marketplace. President Trump recently signed a memorandum directing Secretary Mnuchin and myself to develop a housing finance reform plan. Our plan will ensure that FHA and Ginnie Mae assume primary responsibility for providing housing finance support to low and moderate income families that cannot be fulfilled through traditional underwriting. In some of our housing markets, we're also struggling against the strong headwinds of disaster. In the time I've been Secretary at HUD, this nation has experienced several major disasters. In response, President Trump has signed into law critical emergency funding to support long-term recovery and directed HUD to allocate these resources among the hardest hit states. HUD has fully obligated approximately $7.4 billion through our CDBG-DR program. This money can be used today to help rebuild homes, restore businesses, and repair or replace damaged infrastructure. In addition, we have reviewed and approved state and territorial action plans for another $10 billion. Recovering from a major disaster is never easy. I want to assure this committee that HUD is doing everything we can to help every grantee accelerate the pace of recovery. No discussion of housing would be complete without discussing the absence of housing. Homelessness continues to be a vexing problem in this country, but I'm encouraged to report to you that homelessness is not an intractable problem. As a nation, we've managed to cut veterans' homelessness in half since 2010. Homelessness among families with children is down nearly 30%, and chronic homelessness is down more than 16%. Another area where I believe we can make a difference is ensuring that HUD-assisted housing is decent, safe, and healthy. Shortly after I took office, I ordered a wholesale re-examination of how the department conducts inspections of public housing, as well as private housing under Section 8 contract. And we're moving quickly to prevent carbon monoxide poisoning in HUD-assisted housing. Regrettably, there is currently no universal federal requirement that carbon monoxide detectors be installed in all HUD-assisted housing. That's wrong. Whether through regulation or legislation, it is our intention to require working carbon monoxide detectors in HUD-assisted housing, whether state or local law requires it or not. And to assist PHAs with the purchase and installation of carbon monoxide detectors, HUD is providing $5 million for this simple life-saving device. Finally, let me turn to something that is rather obvious to all of us. In many parts of our country, there is an affordable housing crisis. The federal government cannot solve this problem alone. Let me tell you about a few things we are doing at HUD to find a solution. To date, our rental assistance demonstration has preserved nearly 114,000 units of public housing and generated more than $7 billion in construction activity to revitalize these units or replace them altogether. We are also very excited at the potential for up to $100 billion in capital investment and opportunity zones made possible by the tax reform spearheaded by President Trump. And HUD is proposing a new rule to ensure taxpayer-supported housing support those who are legally entitled to them. Given the overwhelming demand for our programs, the law requires that we devote ourselves to legal residents who have been waiting, some for many years, to access affordable housing. Before I conclude, I want to thank the many members from both parties who have taken time to meet with me during the past 2 years and who are working every day to find common ground in support of safe, decent, and affordable housing. The work isn't easy, but nothing worthwhile ever is. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. On April 25th, 2018, you unveiled a proposal that would triple rents for the lowest income HUD residents. Previously, when you testified before this committee, I explained to you that your proposal, what it would mean for a low-income HUD-assisted senior in my district named Larry. He would see an increase in his rent of around $80, and because he lives on a fixed income of just $1,015, this would be devastating for him. You demonstrated that you did not fully understand the impact of your proposal when you responded to my question by saying that you did not think it was, quote, a typical situation, quote unquote. But according to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, the average rent increase for seniors under your proposal would be $83 or a 30% increase. Dr. Carson, we are currently experiencing an affordable housing crisis. But again this year, you propose the same rent increases in HUD's 2020 budget request. Cannot understand why you would make a family choose between eating or staying housed. Do you understand the impacts of your proposal, and do you continue to defend it?
Well, first of all, thank you for the work that you've done on behalf of poor people in our country. As far as our proposal is concerned, we're talking about increasing rent for the people who pay the minimum rent, and we've protected the elderly and the disabled, hold them completely harmless in that regard. People who pay $25 to $50 a month have been asked to contribute more in order to help sustain the program, and also to encourage them to go out and seek employment. And we're talking about work-able people. We're not talking about people who have to take care of others or have young children. We're talking about people who have perfectly healthy bodies and have
Before you
opportunities
continue
available to them to work.
Mr. Secretary, have you determined for those who you're asking an increase, what their income is and where the money would come from? Are these people on fixed incomes, some of them?
We have made a provision, a hardship provision for anybody who's incapable of doing that. But this is
What about fixed incomes? People on fixed incomes, are they asked to increase, to pay an increase in rent?
We have made provisions for anybody who cannot meet the income that we've asked for. But we've also, this is part of a comprehensive program. The rent proposal is to start the discussion. We need to have a discussion with the lawmakers on what to do because we have so many perverse incentives in place. For instance, you know, if you make more money, you have to report that so your rent can go up. That's a ridiculous thing.
Okay,
You bring
Mr.
somebody
Secretary,
into the
the
household.
example you gave was a senior, not a work-able, that I gave was not a work-able household. And I'm really concerned about that because people on fixed incomes don't have any money for an increase. They can't afford an increase. And I'd like to know exactly what you're doing with people on fixed incomes.
As I said before, the elderly and the disabled are completely protected in the plan that we've proposed.
So they're exempted from any increase?
They have no increase.
They're exempted from any increase, is that
We
correct?
have protected them from any increase.
Okay, continue with your explanation.
And as I was saying, if you make more money, you're penalized for that. If you bring another income-producing person into your environment, you're penalized for that. You have to report that so your rent can be raised. Don't even think about getting married. You probably lose all of your subsidies altogether. These kinds of things have been in our system for a long time. This is all part of a comprehensive
I
plan
hate to
in
keep
order to
interrupting
change
you,
that
but I
scenario.
just got another fact. The average rent increase for a household headed by a person with a disability is a 26% increase. Are you saying this is incorrect?
I'm saying that we have protected the elderly and the disabled from increases.
I really don't know what that means.
That means they're not going to be increased. But the other thing that I hope you just heard me say, this is to start the conversation about something that is a chronic, persistent problem. We have to come up with better, more efficient ways so that we don't leave people in situations where they become dependent.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time has expired, but we can have a discussion all we want about rate increases. If they are not affordable, if they're seniors, if they're on disability, the discussion does them no good. And I am very concerned about that. And with that, the gentleman from North Carolina, Ranking Member Mr. McHenry, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Secretary Carson. During your time at HUD, you've been willing to take on a few tough fights. And I want to speak to the example of the suit that, under your direction and leadership, HUD filed against the New York City Housing Authority, which is the largest housing authority in America. It's the largest housing authority not just in the United States, but in North America. Your lawsuit was about the deplorable conditions of its housing units. Your accusation and HUD's accusation was that the New York Housing Authority was in substantial default under the 1937 Housing Act, allowing for dangerous high levels of lead paint, unsanitary conditions, rats, mice, non-functioning heat in winter, and widespread recurring mold. And in short, things were so bad in so many New York City housing authorities units that at least 19 children were found to have elevated blood lead levels. Some residents were sleeping with their gas ovens on for heat, and 83% of inspected units contained a condition that could pose a health hazard to a tenant. This was covered up for years, so bad that the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York said that their failure to provide decent, safe, and sanitary housing is simply unacceptable and illegal. You sued the New York City Housing Authority, and then in January of this year, they voluntarily entered into a consent decree with HUD. So can you walk us through that and the steps that are being taken going forward?
Yes, well...
so that we can keep children and those that are in these units safe and healthy.
Yes, we were very concerned, particularly about the lead situation and the number of children who have been affected. You know, lead poisoning for a child is devastating, not only acutely, but it has a lifelong impact. And not only does it decrease their abilities, but it's very costly to society in terms of their potential. But in the case of NYCHA, the New York City Housing Authority, they had been prevaricating about what they were doing during their inspections, covering it up completely. And in addition to that, allowing mold to fester, which was causing a lot of problems with asthma, which has a very substantial medical cost to it as well. Not having up protected barriers where they need to be, trip hazards, elevators that weren't working. I mean, it was a total disaster. And in situations like that, in the past, you know, HUD has frequently taken places into receivership. I've not taken any place into receivership since I've been here, because in looking over the history of that, it's not turned out particularly well in all cases. And decided that we really would work with the city, the mayor and myself, who come from very different political places, decided we would put aside the political differences and concentrate on the people and what could be done in order to help the people of NYCHA. We decided to put a monitor in, a federal monitor who has much experience in that case. We put in measurements that have to be met and times when they have to be met, and we are proceeding along that line. A CEO is in the process of being selected now, and we are going to keep a very close eye on it, and we are going to hold them to the metrics that have been put in place, because again, no one deserves to live in that setting.
Well, thank you for speaking to the humanity involved, not the physical structures, but actually speaking to the people that inhabit these places, and they deserve to live in a healthy, safe place. I want to raise opportunity zones, and I know other people have questions about opportunity zones and your leadership on the White House Opportunity Revitalization Council, but my time is cut short. I thank you for your testimony. Thanks for your leadership and your service to our country. I yield back.
Thank you.
The gentlewoman from New York, Mrs. Maloney, who is also the chair for the Subcommittee on Investor Protection, Entrepreneurship, and Capital Markets, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, the D in HUD does not stand for deportation. I'm afraid that a recent proposal of yours will bring nothing but despair to thousands of American families by throwing children out of their homes. Simply put, we cannot create affordable housing for Americans by throwing other Americans out into the street with no place to go. I am very proud to represent Queensbridge Houses, which is the largest public housing complex in the entire country, along with many other public housing complexes. So I've been working with public housing tenants since 1981, standing up for tenants' rights, fighting against spending cuts, and exposing and ending corrupt mob contracts. But your plan to create vacancies by making 55,000 American children homeless is among the most damaging proposals I have ever seen in public policy, and quite frankly, I find it despicable. You know that the current laws already prohibit federal housing programs from subsidizing undocumented immigrants. Individuals who are not eligible for housing assistance do not receive subsidies. By evicting mixed-status households, you will rip apart families and be throwing children onto the street. And where will the 55,000 children go? Where will they live? What agency will care for their health and education? Is your plan to have ICE put 55,000 more children on cages on the border? Really, not in my district and not on my watch. This is a horrible plan. New York City now spends more than $600 million per year to support 8,200 children in foster care, and $4.5 billion more every year to tackle homelessness. Have you considered how you would support the newly homeless families and children? Will they be going to foster care? What's your plan?
Well, first of all, thank you for the work that you've done on behalf of the people, and I appreciated our visit in New York.
Thank you.
You know, as far as what we're doing with housing, the law that has been provided through Congress states very specifically that the Secretary of HUD may not provide housing assistance to people who are here illegally. It also states specifically that the Secretary has the duty to end assistance if he finds that someone is violating that. So we are following the law. I would also point out to you
But may I respond? By law, I agree with you. You don't provide subsidies to people who are here illegally. But these children were born here in America. And even if their families are illegal, it's a mixed family in terms of legality, the children are legal. So you could have a situation where the parents are deported and the children, they leave the children here, American citizens, and who is going to take care of these children? Do you have a plan to take care of these 55,000 children, which is HUD's number that came forward with, that they project could be hurt by this plan? Do you have a plan for how to take care of these children, yes or no?
a couple of things here. First of all, there are hundreds of thousands of children, as well as elderly and disabled people on the waiting list who are legal American citizens.
But, Mr. Secretary, these children are legal American citizens. They were born in America. They are legal citizens.
As I was saying, there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, who are waiting on the list. Do you suggest that we prioritize people who are
You're going to pick
illegal
one
situations?
American citizen over another. Again, these children are American citizens. They are legal. And what is your plan to take care of them?
If you read the rule carefully, you will see that it provides a 6-month deferral on request if they have not found another place to live. And that can be renewed 2 times for a total of 18 months, which is plenty of time for Congress to engage in comprehensive immigration reform so that this becomes a moot point, as does the DACA situation and 100 other things.
How in the world can you put forward a plan that could
The
leave
gentlelady's time has
55,000 children homeless?
The gentlewoman from Missouri, Ms. Wagner, is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairwoman. I thank Secretary Carson for his testimony today and for his service. Would you like a minute, sir? Any more time to respond?
Thank you very much. The fact of the matter is, Congress has the responsibility for making the laws that govern this, and they have the ability to change that. And if, in fact, you want to explain to the American citizens who've been on the wait list for several years in your district in New York why we should continue to support families that are not here legally, I would be happy to join you in helping to explain that to them.
Thank you, and I'm glad you could finish your answer. Congressman Al Green and I have written and worked on legislation that addresses major challenges facing the disaster relief funding process at HUD. According to numerous IG reports and a hearing that the Financial Services Oversight and Investigations Committee held in March, major issues have been identified with the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program. Some of the difficulties identified are the potential duplication of benefits, slow disbursement of disaster-related funding, and delays in funding for low and moderate income citizens. While HUD has become a primary provider of disaster recovery, this program is not codified in statute. HUD uses more than 60 Federal Register notices to issue clarifying guidance, waivers, and alternative requirements to oversee at least 113 active disaster recovery grants, which totaled more than $47 billion as of last year. Codifying the CDBG-DR program would provide a framework for future disasters, reduce the over-reliance on Federal Register notices for each disaster, and speed delivery of disaster assistance to grantees and disaster victims. Codification provides proper controls that protect against waste, fraud, and abuse. Mr. Secretary, are you aware of these challenges within the CDBG-DR program, and how are you making sure these funds are directed towards the Americans who need it the most?
Thank you very much for that question and for the visits that we've had to discuss this and other matters. I actually very much agree with the whole concept of appropriate codification. You and Congressman Green have been working on this, I know, with some others. And the big advantage, of course, is, you start out on second base instead of starting out from home. And there are a lot of things that are done consistently all the time, and you can get those things codified and done quickly so that you can decrease the amount of time. I'm in agreement with that, and we're very happy to work with you. We're already making some progress in that area, and I think we can do this because one of the things that has concerned me is the amount of time it takes to get grants out.
Right.
And I've asked every office at HUD to look at their own internal procedures and see what they can do to speed it up. If you have 10 offices and 9 of them get things done quickly and one of them takes 6 months, the whole thing takes 6 months.
And there's got to be coordination between HUD, SBA, FEMA, state agencies, all talking to each other to make sure there's procurement issues. I so look forward to working and continuing my work with Congressman Green to bring this to the floor. So I thank you for your support and for your commitment to this. Quickly moving on, the world's largest Catholic healthcare system, Ascension, is headquartered in St. Louis region. Ascension is implementing a comprehensive organizational response to trafficking survivors at its hospitals. Unfortunately, Ascension can only establish these programs where emergency housing is available. I understand that the Continuum of Care FY18 competition focus included $50 million for housing services for domestic violence and trafficking survivors. Will HUD extend this program and ensure that projects including housing for trafficking survivors are there more permanent ways that HUD can address transitional housing needs for trafficking survivors, sir?
Well, trafficking is obviously horrendous, and there's a lot more of it going on these days. And we definitely need to take care of that, and that was a very good program. It turns out that you all have funded that for the 19 season, so yes, it will be continued.
Wonderful. I'm glad to hear that. My time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Velasquez, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Carson, in defending HUD's recently proposed immigration rule, you released the following statement: there is an affordable housing crisis in this country, and we need to make certain our scarce public resources help those who are legally entitled to it. Secretary, do you know how many people are in the waiting list for public housing and Section 8 vouchers?
In your district, you mean?
No, nationwide.
There are hundreds of thousands.
No, there are 4.4 million people, by the way. So, do you know how many units would open up as a result of the proposed rule? How many units?
Probably,
if that proposed rule
probably at least 32,000.
25 to 35 units. So, you are going to put children on the streets to open up 25 to 35,000 units, and these are American children. Where are they going to go? They will go into the shelter system. They will become homeless children. Those are American children. So the question is not where they're going to go. The question to you, sir, is why, if you recognize that there is a housing crisis in our nation, that there are 4.4 million people in a waiting list, why you are not asking, or why did you request $9.6 billion less for HUD's budget for fiscal year 2020, including zeroing out the capital fund and requesting $350 million less for the Section 8 program. Do you understand why this sounds like you're talking from both sides of your mouth? You know, your regional director in New York, Ms. Lynn Patton, has been spending nights living in public housing, but apparently she forgot to talk to you because this budget request doesn't reconcile what she's seeing on the ground. And I found it hypocritical that people come here and talk about the situation of public housing in New York, and you have not been here when we have been advocating for increasing the capital fund so that we could make repairs and we could address the issue of mold. In fact, when you went to the hearings, confirmation hearings in the Senate side, you said that as a doctor, you will want to take care of the children in public housing, the health of children in public housing. Sir, this budget is shameful. It's immoral. It fails American citizens just for the sake of scoring political points. So, did you have any conversations about this proposed rule with the staff at the White House, including Senior Advisor Stephen Miller or Acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney? Did you?
We have conversations all the time about many of our policies.
And did you consult with any national affordable housing organizations, tenant rights, or immigration groups?
We have conversations with such groups all the time.
Did you have conversation with the largest New York City public housing authority in the nation, New York? Did you?
I think what is important is what are we going to do about the problem? That would make a lot more sense.
Reclaiming my time. You know, don't sit there, sir, and say about a national conversation. We need to have a national conversation about homelessness in our nation, about the disrepair of public housing in our nation. You know what it takes? It takes money. It takes the budget. You have created this crisis by the disinvestment that have taken place in public housing in our nation.
We have a very substantial affordable housing crisis, and there are two ways to approach it. Continue to throw money at it, which has been done for a long time without solving the problem, or ask yourself, why do you have that problem of escalating prices? I can say more about that.
I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, they continue to ask you questions and not allow you time to answer them. I mean, that's pretty selfish, pretty bad behavior. So if you want any time to answer anything, you just give me a thumbs up and I'll yield time.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I mean, it does seem a little
What did you
silly
say?
to have a hearing where you ask them on a question and you can't answer it. It seems like more of a platform to
Would the
make a
gentleman
speech.
yield?
But at any rate,
No,
You call me selfish
I yield.
by fighting here for
call you-
children in America? Shame
Madam
on you.
Chair, order, please.
Order,
Dr.
please.
Carson has my time.
Mr. Posey.
now, in terms of affordable housing crisis, we have to ask ourselves, why is there an affordable housing crisis in a country like ours? There are so many regulatory issues and zoning restrictions that add to the cost. For a new construction single-family home now, we're talking 25 to 27%. For multifamily construction, we're talking 32.1% up to 42% in a quarter of cases. Unless we begin to tackle the things that are driving these prices, we're just chasing our tails by just saying we got to throw more money at it. We have to analyze these things carefully. We have to use our brains. We have to think logically rather than just emotionally if we're going to solve these problems. And they can be solved if we work together, rather than making everything into a political platform and trying to score points.
Well stated, Mr. Secretary, and I'm saddened to see you come here only to be bullied and berated for not breaking the law, actually. And I don't know, if they were suggesting that you should separate these children from their families as a way to comply. I don't know if that's their suggestion, but it's off the wall thinking, and I respect you for following the law. All of us here should be impressed that HUD's 2020 budget request continues the federal goal to prevent and end homelessness by sinking nearly $2.6 billion to support thousands of local housing and service programs assisting the homeless. And while, a lot of the people up here do a lot of talking, you've actually been doing a lot of work, and you've actually been accomplishing things. And I want you to know that a lot of people do recognize that and appreciate it. Your list of accomplishments is extraordinary, just like the track record of your personal life. And we're pleased that you have chosen to dedicate your clearly superior intellect and desire to help other people in a position that you are. I just can't imagine that you're willing to put yourself and your family through this, but we're so grateful that you are willing to do that.
Thank you.
Mr. Secretary, I've been a vocal supporter of easing restrictions on FHA loans for condominiums. Written you a letter before with Mr. Cleaver from the other side. Could you give us an update on where that is?
Yeah, the condominium issue is a sticky issue. It's very complex, fraught with risk, and we've been doing a very in-depth analysis, working with it, have submitted new rules for it that has gone over to OMB, and we expect to have the final rules on condominiums out by this fall.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, sir. Also, we recently discussed your recent proposed rules issued under Section 3 of the HUD Act of 68. Just wonder if you could share with us the important improvements you've made.
Yes, Section 3 is an extremely important part of the Housing Act because it requires that if you're getting HUD money, that you have to hire, train, or give contracts to the low-income people in the area. It's been largely ignored because it's so encumbered with regulatory requirements that nobody wants to use it. So we've done an in-depth analysis of it, removed a lot of those encumbrances, added incentives, and the new rules for Section 3 will be coming out this summer.
Excellent. Well, again, my time's about to expire, Mr. Secretary, but I again want to thank you for your service and express that I'm embarrassed by the way you're treating this committee.
Thank you.
Yield back.
Thank you very much. Let me remind you, members will refrain from impugning the personal motives of other members. The gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chairman, the member controls their 5 minutes. The witness controls the 5-minute opening statement, and many of our witnesses have a outstanding bully pulpit outside this room. To then turn and say to members they don't control even their 5 minutes is a denigration of our role as members of this committee. As to affordable housing, the witness does point out that there are barriers to the creation of more rental units, and we need many, many hundreds of thousands built. We need to keep interest rates low. Zoning in most cities makes it impossible to build rental housing in neighborhoods where people are not poor. And we can say we don't discriminate against poor people, we just discriminate against people who don't want to live 6 families to the acre or 4 families to the acre. You cannot build affordable rental housing 6 families to the acre. And we also have the fiscalization of land use planning, where cities are financed often based on the money they can get from commercial development, and they fight in my state over who can prevent housing from being built on certain empty acreage. If they can only get an auto dealer there, they get the sales tax. So the fiscalization of land use planning also keeps cities from allowing rental housing to be built. I know Ms. Maloney is not here, but Secretary, I want to thank you for being perhaps the only person in your administration to support comprehensive immigration reform. and reform which would have provided and which would provide legal status for the families that Ms. Maloney from New York is concerned about. As to somewhat more mundane matters, the FHA has specific mortgage requirements, some of which are servicing requirements. I'm talking about mortgage servicing, some of which are antiquated. In your ongoing efforts to make the FHA program more attractive to lenders, what is HUD doing to better align FHA servicing requirements to those of GSEs?
Well, one of the things that we're doing is working with the Justice Department on the False Claims Act, which has driven away, quite a few of the lenders who are concerned about non-material mistakes and the consequences for them. And that will open up a lot more borrowing options for people.
Do you see a need for legislation for us to somewhat correct the False Claims Act, or can this be done administratively?
We're going to try to do it at the administrative level, but appreciate the implication that you would help us if legislation is needed.
Okay. The rental assistance demonstration program focuses on public housing authorities. The program allows public housing authorities to convert housing properties at risk of obsolescence into project-based vouchers under Section 8. Are you familiar with the RAD program, and do you think it's effective?
I'm very familiar with it. It's a spectacular program. Already, we've been able to convert well over 100,000 units, contribute $7 billion toward capital needs. It's one of the most spectacular programs, and one of the things that would help us tremendously legislatively is to lift the cap on RAD. Right now, it's at 455,000 units, but there are so many places across the country that are requesting it, and there's absolutely no reason that it shouldn't be lifted. It's already been demonstrated to be extremely effective.
Thank you, and we should look at that. Now, the FHA is concerned about people having down payments, and some get assistance from their families, some get assistance from government entities, and the differentiation in default rates is like 0.2% between whether you get aid from a government entity or a family, and yet you're being pretty restrictive on the government entity aid, and this particularly affects some Indian tribes who are being told that they can only make loans or provide rental assistance in their own geographic area, which can be a small reservation. Can you look at this?
Yes, we are in the process of looking at that. As you know, there's been a 90-day delay on that, and we are, in fact, looking at it, but it's also in litigation, so not really free to talk too much about it.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Lukemeyer, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm over here, Mr. Carson. Thank you, Dr. Carson. Dr. Carson, one area this committee has examined at length this Congress is the lack of affordable housing in this country. A main cause for the shortage of affordable housing is the regulatory burdens that increase the cost of a mortgage, which you've described a minute ago, actually for some types of housing, 32 to 40%. One impending rule HUD should be focused on affects the affordability of housing is the impending Current Expected Credit Loss Accounting Standard, or CECL. This accounting standard requires banks to incur the full loss of a loan at the moment it is originated. I've heard concerns about CECL from numerous industries, including community and regional banks, credit unions, realtors, and home builders. Many of these concerns stem around housing affordability. According to the National Association of Home Builders, who have testified in this committee twice over the last 4 or 5 months, that an increase in the cost of a house by $1,000 prices 100,000 people out of a home. My question to you this morning is, have you looked at the effects of CECL, what they could have on the ability of someone to afford a home?
Yes, we have. It is difficult when you're trying to project out into the future, risk of that nature. And we're in the process of studying that very carefully. We don't want to make a mistake on that.
Are you coming up with a study on the effect of the individuals, the number of folks, the effect on your the amount you're having to reserve, and what the kind of reaction you'd have to come up with to be able to increase those reserves?
All of those parameters are being looked at.
So if you have to increase your reserves, what is the source of income for you?
Excuse me?
I say if you have to increase your reserves, what is a source of income by which you would be able to do that?
Where would the money come from?
Yeah,
From
right.
which we'd be able to do that?
Right?
Not sure.
Have to increase your guarantee fees, perhaps?
That is one suggestion.
Okay. If that happens, that increases the cost of a loan, which home builders say keeps people from having access to a loan, right?
Yeah, so, you have to look at all the possible sources and model it out to see what the long-term effect is.
Now, this is going to affect the GSEs as well. Have you been looking at that effect? Have you talked to Freddie and Fannie to see how this is going to impact them? Any sort of coordination with all of all these other government agencies that may or may not impact?
We do talk about that. I will be at a FA meeting this afternoon, actually. I'm sure that topic will come up.
Interesting. So are they monitoring this? Are you aware of it? Are you?
I'm sorry.
Are they monitoring? Are you aware if they're monitoring this at all, or coming up with studies to look at the costs that they may incur, what they're going to have to, what they may do to react to this?
I'm not sure what you mean.
Okay. Well, I mean, in your communications with them, are they looking at how to increase the reserves? Are they going to borrow money from the Treasury? Are they going to increase the guarantee fees? Or have you discussed that at all with them? Or is that part of the meeting this afternoon?
They are looking at how do they backstop themselves. Right now, in conservatorship, they don't have to worry about that. If they come out of conservatorship, that becomes a very different question about where that money comes from. And there are multiple discussions about where it would come from.
Okay, one of the questions that you were answering a while ago with regards to the cost drivers for affordable housing. And, I guess my question to you is, how much authority do you have at HUD, if any, with the ability to waive certain rules and regulations, or change certain rules and regulations, or suspend certain rules and regulations? Is there certain rules and regulations you have the ability to do that with, or are your hands pretty well tied and Congress has to be the one to change the way that this all works?
The vast majority of the regulations are done at a local level. So we can't change those. What we can do is try to incentivize people at the local level to begin to look at some of these rules and to address them, and they get preference points when they do that. And a lot of people are actually starting to realize that and do that. A lot of these regulations have been on the books for 10, 20, 50, 100 years, have nothing to do with what's going on now. The density requirements frequently don't take into account some of the new modern building techniques. And, as far as the whole affordability issue is concerned, in addition to financial issues, we have to look at modern technologies that have come to the fore. And I can continue that at some point.
My time has expired. Thank you very much for your service, sir.
The gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Clay, who is also the chair for the Subcommittee on Housing, Community Development, and Insurance, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Mr. Secretary, let's discuss the Wellston, Missouri Housing Authority, and which HUD has had in receivership for the last 22 years. And as you are aware, there is a planned demolition of a number of units which will displace tenants, uproot lives, and cause utter confusion in those lives. Children will be forced to change schools, and some parents will have drastic changes to their life and work schedules. As you know, we are looking at several options which we have discussed, including the grand families concept and Section 202 housing. Could you please walk us through a displacement such as this and tell us, what does HUD do to serve the affordable housing needs of these residents and ensure that they have access to safe, affordable, and modern housing?
All right. Well, thank you for that question, and thank you for the times that we've had a chance to discuss this and to visit in your district, where the people seem to like you very much. You know, certainly, we're very concerned about any time people have to be displaced, which is why we have tenant protection vouchers. Not only do we provide those, but we provide relocation services to help those individuals to be able to adjust. And in some cases, you know, they end up finding places that they like considerably better, and they don't even want to come back after the problem has been rectified. But we do want to give them those choices. We also have been working very vigorously with the housing choice vouchers to make them more palatable, because there are many places where landlords won't accept them. And we've done some studies to find out why they won't accept them. Some of them are really quite interesting. For instance, in San Diego, there was great resistance. And then the city guaranteed all the landlords that they would repair any damage that was done, because the landlords were afraid that these Section 8 people would destroy their property. Cost the city almost nothing, because people were not destroying their property. They're not going to destroy their property. They've been waiting for a long time to get this voucher. They're not going to do that. But sometimes you have to fight the perception, and that was done. But there are lots of other things that impact that. But we look very carefully at how we can make sure that those people are taken care of who are displaced.
And speaking of that, you know, St. Louis County government is considering an ordinance that will prohibit source of income discrimination as far as housing vouchers are concerned, which I think will address it at the local level. Can you give us some examples of public-private partnerships that could work for a community like Wellston, or have you given that any thought?
I think there are many of them around the country. You know, purpose-built communities. There's like Eastlake outside of Atlanta, which, as some people here probably know, was one of the worst places in terms of crime, in terms of poverty, schools performing at the lowest level in the state, and through the public-private partnerships, building of mixed-income housing, bringing in grocery stores, places for work, employment. They were able to convert that neighborhood completely. I went to one of the charter schools that they put in the high school. I was met by 5 students playing the harp. The things that they had available were absolutely outstanding. Those schools achieve at the highest levels in the state now, better than many of the private schools. So can it be done? Absolutely. It needs to be done in a holistic manner. Do we have the ability to do this in this country? We absolutely do. We'll never get it done if we fight each other. But if we recognize the problem and begin to work with each other, everybody has good ideas.
Will the gentleman yield? Mr. Klein. Do I hear a commitment to Wellston?
We were getting to that, ma'am.
The gentleman is committing to helping to do it.
I will ask the question.
Thank you.
Go right ahead.
Of course, we're going to be very interested in Wellston, and of course, we're going to be interested in helping there.
And you're committed, HUD is committed to working with us in that community to make sure that.
Right, and we want to continue to work with you on that. Absolutely.
I appreciate it. My time has expired, and I yield back, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Duffy, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Welcome, Dr. Carson. I imagine I was almost said former doctor, but as a doctor, you probably prefer to deal with the root causes of someone's health problem as opposed to just the symptom of the problem.
Absolutely.
And so you're somewhat getting bludgeoned by my colleagues about your rule on non-citizens and your rule that actually follows the law that was passed by Congress. But I would note that it seems like in the last several months, we have 50,000 illegals coming across our border every month. And when there is an open border and people continue to flood into our country, you're going to have more problems of illegal parents and maybe U.S. citizen children. And so maybe instead of bludgeoning you as the Secretary of HUD, maybe the Congress should actually deal with securing the southern border, recognizing it's a crisis, and take responsibility ourselves, which my friends across the aisle, we have to deal with this problem. Maybe it's not, Dr.
What sense?
Maybe just in regard to your rule, you're basically saying, I'm going to follow the law and I'm going to let U.S. citizens take a priority in housing that comes from HUD. Is that right?
That's correct. Although I'm open. I'm not a hard nose. So if someone can tell me, how to follow the law and still take care of their issue, I'm all ears. I'm ready to hear it.
So in the way you structured this rule to actually follow the law that's passed by Congress, did you give some extra time for the Congress to act and maybe change the law?
Yeah, they can have a 6-month deferral, and they can renew that twice. So that's 18 months, which should be plenty of time if Congress was actually interested in solving the problem.
And again, I just want to put a period on the point that this problem is getting worse. And this is not compassion. I was just at the border. And to look at what's happening to families and the journey and the sexual assaults and the indentured servitude of people who come up through cartels and have to work for the cartels once they get here, this is not compassion. What you experience is not compassion. But I applaud you because I believe as an American citizen, we should put Americans first.
Absolutely. And if we're not going to be a nation of laws, what happens if we say, we can ignore this one, we don't like this one, but this one will do? Where does that lead in the long run? To nothing but chaos.
To chaos. I want to pivot because you had mentioned, maybe one of the pathways forward is to look at the cost of housing. Why has it become so unaffordable? Again, we're looking at the symptom of increased costs. Is why don't we look at the root cause? And you mentioned, I think, regulation and zoning that can drive up the cost of housing. Are there any examples where you have local governments that have actually tried to address their zoning rules and their regulations and maybe allow for more development of multifamily structures that can drive down prices but also improve the stock?
Yes, there are several cities who have engaged in that. They have come to recognize one very important thing. A lot of this regulatory, these barriers are caused by NIMBYism, not in my backyardism. And I actually understand that because the most valuable thing that most people have is their home. And they have in their mind the model of 1960s and 70s where the government would come in and build these massive structures with no forethought, no holistic planning, leave, and they would deteriorate. And nobody wants that around them. But of course, we got to get the message out that the government doesn't do that anymore. Now we do public-private partnerships. We do things that match the community because we want, nurses and policemen and firemen, teachers to be able to live in the same community where they work. That doesn't decrease the value. I think that increases the value of the community.
But with a little restructuring on zoning and rules, we can actually lower the cost of housing, right?
Absolutely.
I wanted to get to Puerto Rico. My time is almost up, but I know that you have allowed for, $1.8 billion in disaster relief to go to Puerto Rico. You have some strings attached, which I agree with. And any objections from the Puerto Ricans thus far in how you've structured the money?
None whatsoever. The governor and I have been working together, and they have $1.5 billion immediately available to them, of which they've used $250,000.
250 million or 250,000?
Mr. Scott is recognized for 5 minutes.
I go back.
Thank you very much, Chair Lady. Dr. Carson over here. Good to have you back again.
Thank you.
Dr. Carson, are you familiar with own-to-option mortgage programs?
In general, yes.
In general. Well, the National Urban Institute has recognized this as an excellent way to move people into home ownership. Have you reviewed this? How receptive are you to it?
I'm very receptive to the idea, recognizing that home ownership is the principal mechanism of wealth accumulation in this country. The average renter has a net worth of $5,000, the average homeowner $200,000. That's a 40-fold increase. So we're looking at multiple ways, including renter-to-ownership models to increase home ownership, particularly amongst some of the demographics that have fallen behind.
That's very good, and I encourage you to continue that as well. Now, let me go to a project you had mentioned some time ago as being one of your real projects that you can take some authorship in. It's called Envision Centers. Could you tell us about that? I've spoken with some of the public housing authorities in my district down in Georgia, like East Point Housing Authority and many others, and they seem to be very excited about this. Tell us a little more about that, will you?
Yeah, well, the ideal comes from the Bible. Proverbs 29.
Hold on, it comes from the Bible?
From the Bible. Proverbs
Very good.
29:18 says, without a vision, the people perish. So we said, we'll call these vision centers, but then we thought everybody would think they were getting glasses, so we call them Envision Centers. But it's a place where we can bring together all of the various services that are available to move people towards self-sufficiency. So instead of them going to 17 different places, they can get all of these services under one roof. We had the first demonstration of 17 cities, and 13 of them have opened already. Some of them are doing extremely well. And you know, this is just a model which I think is going to explode very soon, and we're going to have a lot of these.
Let me ask you this now. You mentioned when you made that announcement last April, I believe, you did say, as you just mentioned, 17 centers open. But to our available knowledge that has come to us, only three, not 13. So there's some discrepancy there. Are you aware of that?
There may be, but there was actually an article in OAN this week that details the 13 that are open.
Okay, that's good, the Invention Centers. I hope you continue that. Folks in Georgia and my district are very excited about it, and so I look forward to working with you. Now, tell me and give me a very good update and let me know, because the last time you were here, you and I had a very spirited conversation about your desire, or it wasn't your desire, it was, as you said in your statement, somebody said that we ought to zero out the Community Development Block Grant Program. After you and I talk, tell me, are we secure with that program, or do you and I have to go to battle once more on that?
Well, I don't think we ever have to go to battle, regardless of whether we...
Well, let me tell you, man, if you all move 1 inch to zero out the most effective program that cities and states and counties use to lift themselves up and be the cities and towns that they need, yes, we will go to battle. I'm asking you, will we have to go to battle? Are you all still planning to zero out the budget for the CBDG program? Yes or no?
Let me just say, I don't think we ever need to go to battle, regardless of anything. Having said that, you know, as I've said before, the CDBG program has been helpful in many cases.
No, I know my time is short, but have you moved away from zeroing out that budget, yes or no?
It's not a yes or no question.
Yes, it is.
You just want to make it into a battle. It doesn't need to be a
No, I
battle.
want a yes or no answer. You're going to do it or you're not. Apparently, you all still have that on the
The
table.
gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Stivers, is recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Scott, your question was not answered. Mr. Stivers? Mr. Barr, the gentleman from Kentucky, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And Secretary, thanks for being back in front of our committee, and I think you're doing a great job. I appreciate the good work that you're doing despite some of the criticism that you're receiving here today, and I applaud you and this administration from breaking from the tired old past, the old ways of doing things where you just threw money at welfare programs and expected to cure poverty. Well, we know after $20 trillion since the war on poverty was declared in 1964, that didn't work. But what is working is the Trump economy. What is working is tax cuts and deregulation. We have the lowest unemployment in 50 years. We have the lowest unemployment among African Americans, Hispanic Americans in 50 years of all time for those categories. We see wages rising faster today than we did since before the Great Recession. We're seeing jobs being created, more people getting off of food stamps, more people moving into self-sufficiency. So opportunity zones and these policies are producing growth and lifting people out of poverty and away from government dependency, and I applaud you for that. Secretary Carson, I want to thank you for taking time to come to Kentucky and visiting St. James Place and the Hope Center, and the work that the people are doing there, the nonprofit community, the faith-based groups that are working with people who are recovering from addiction. And as we discussed on your visit, the opioid crisis has hit Kentucky very hard. This issue has had a tragic impact on countless families across our state and across the country. According to the National Institute on Drug Abuse, every day more than 130 people in the United States are dying as a result of opioid overdoses, not just pills, but heroin and fentanyl as well. Last Congress, as you know, we passed H.R. 6 to help combat the opioid epidemic, and included in this legislation was a bill that I introduced, the Career Act. When fully implemented by your agency, this legislation will create a pilot program to help individuals in their recovery from substance abuse disorder to secure stable transitional housing and job training. And I want to thank you and HUD for taking the first step towards implementation of this program with the publication of a funding formula in March. That said, as I indicated, 130 deaths a day. We've got to move these pilots forward as expeditiously as possible. Is it possible for HUD to move forward with this pilot in this fiscal year?
Yes, we are already moving forward with it, recognizing, as you said, that this is a national tragedy. And, you know, we need to actually stop and look at how do we integrate the various agencies and federal, state, and local agencies in order to take care of this, because it is a national problem. And what people need to recognize about opioids is you can get hooked on them in a matter of a week or two. But changes that occur in the brain frequently take 12 to 18 months to correct. So unless you're involved in an ongoing program, you're probably not going to be successful. You're going to have relapses. And then that continues to drive the cost. So we really need to have a much more comprehensive way that we look at it. The career program is going to help us do that.
Well, thank you for your leadership and working with us to move that program forward as quickly as possible so that we can save lives and move folks out of recovery and into long-term jobs and a life addiction-free life. Just yesterday, sir, HUD rescinded its May 2017 carport letters that did not go through the proper administrative process to begin with and required alternative construction approval for all homes built that were built carport ready. I want to thank you for this, because that policy proposed a costly and time-consuming hurdle for the production of manufactured homes that negatively impacted consumers and forced many manufacturers to stop offering these carport-ready homes. We talk about affordable housing. Over-regulation from HUD in the past has been an impediment to affordable housing, particularly manufactured housing. But we still see that this Manufactured Housing Consensus Committee, this advisory committee, has put forward a lot of recommendations like this, and HUD still has not finalized more than 100 recommendations by the MHCC, some going back a decade. What can be done to change the internal processes at HUD so that more of these recommendations are more promptly adopted?
Well, we've beefed up the division that is working on manufactured housing recently so that they're not just sort of treading water. They're able to really make forward progress right now. But, you know, on the whole concept of affordable housing, manufactured housing is a critical part of that. About 10% of single-family housing units are manufactured housing units. The technology has increased dramatically, so that better than site-built housing in many cases.
Thanks for your attention to that, sir. I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, who is also the chair for the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I thank the ranking member as well. Thank the witness for appearing today. And I'd like to also thank Ms. Wagner. She initially called to my attention this CDBG-DR program, the possibility of getting something done, and she and I have worked together to try to perfect it to the extent that it can be perfected, so I'm grateful to her. I'm also grateful to the staffs for working on this. While she and I presented concepts, the staff actually worked together to make sure that our ideals were achieved to the extent that they can be. So let's just talk for just a moment about the time that you mentioned earlier with the CDBG-DR, disaster relief, for edification purposes for persons who may be listening and not privy to information about this. This program is something that comes into being after we've had a disaster, and we currently reinvent the wheel each and every time. We don't always have the institutional knowledge available to us. People move on, and we sometimes have to not only reinvent the wheel, we have to reinvent some of the various components. It would be a good thing, in my opinion, to codify this program. Can you speak briefly to the timeline and how the timeline could be benefited by codification?
Yes. There's no question that particularly early on after a disaster, some of the coordination that has to occur between small business, FEMA, and HUD is duplicative. And there are ways that we can streamline that process. And then some of the basic things that have to be done in order to get the grant money out is absolutely the same thing over and over again. And that's what I meant when I said, you know, if we can get those things codified, we can start out on second base on our way home rather than having to go completely around the whole thing. So what you're talking about makes 100% sense, and I'm 100% in agreement with it, and we're going to be continuing to work with your group to make sure it gets done.
Thank you for the announcement of support. Let's move to HR 123, which is the FHA Additional Credit Pilot Program. There are many people who are first-time home buyers who have thin credit, but they do pay utilities, light bill, gas bill, water bill, phone bill, and they do this religiously. They're not late, but these things are not always scored. It can be done on an individual case-by-case basis. This is important not only to the person who may be able to purchase a home, but it's also important to the rest of us because when that home is purchased, washers and dryers and curtains and other things are purchased that will impact the economy. I'm hopeful that you'll be able to support FHA Additional Credit Pilot Program. Doesn't mean that other credit options that are scored will cease to be scored. This is not a substitute, it's in addition to. Would you comment, please, on this program and the possibility of your supporting it?
Well, there's no question that some people come with a very thin credit record and they're placed at a very significant disadvantage. And, you know, I was recently looking at a study in which they looked at how a person paid their rent and how often, they paid on time, how often they paid late, and they factor that into the credit rating. And in most cases, it actually improved their credit score and made it better. So we're doing some more in-depth looking at that. The commissioner, FHA commissioner, and I have been talking about this, alternative credit scores. Again, recognizing that it has to be done a responsible way, because you remember before the housing crisis, people were going through some things that weren't quite legitimate and put a lot of people into houses that they could not afford. And as a result of that, they lost the house, they lost their credit, and they lost their future opportunities. We certainly don't want to get into that situation, so we will study it carefully. But I'm very open to that alternative credit, and I appreciate you're working on that.
I thank you and look forward to our continued work to bring these two programs to fruition. Thank you, Madam Chair.
The gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Tipton, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Ms. Secretary, thank you for being here, and I appreciate the comments you've made so far today. Did want to bring up some local issues for us in Colorado. Had the opportunity to be able to visit with some of our local housing authorities, and in Colorado, they've been indicating that it seems that HUD has a one-size-fits-all approach to its guidelines. One program I've heard to be particularly challenging for some of the smaller housing authorities is the Real Estate Assessment Center program. They've been suggesting that the inspection guidelines are stringent, difficult to be able to meet, especially in physical inspection demand by the staff who need to be able to visit multiple scattered sites. The GAO recently released a list of recommendations to be able to improve the physical inspection program process and oversight for the inspectors. Has your department reviewed some of these recommendations and considered including them into the execution of the program?
Yes, and this is an area that has really captured my interest, because I was so interested when I came in and found people getting passing REACT scores in places that I wouldn't want a dog to live in, and vice versa. It just made absolutely no sense, and it was so inconsistent. So we're doing a top-to-bottom analysis of the whole REACT scoring process, changing it. We have, moved out some of the inspectors who had questionable character, and brought in another host of inspectors. But we're also looking at the way that we do the procurement of the inspectors. Before, you would take the lowest bidder always. And sometimes you get what you pay for, so you obviously have to be cognizant of that.
Great. Thank you for that. And I'd like to be able to get your opinion just in regards to regulations, their flexibility. Do you think you have enough flexibility to be able to accommodate large and small operators as well as urban and rural areas?
Well, we always would like more flexibility. There's no question about that. It gives us a lot more ability to move quickly and to be able to do things. But, we will manage with what we have.
Well, and I appreciate that. That's really one of the challenges. We obviously have legislators from urban areas represent a rural area. And so some of the distinct differences between it being able to accommodate and to be able to be responsive, to be able to meet those needs, I think is very important. I've heard from some of my constituents that programs like the Housing Authority scoring system don't account for important considerations like individual market conditions. Have you given thought to making a more geographically driven approach to some of the regulations?
I'm always in favor of local control and not heavy-handed federal bureaucracy. So, if you have some specific suggestions about things that we should be doing to make that even more available, I'm very happy to work with you on that.
Thank you, and we will follow up with you on that. We're trying, I like you, to be able to have it locally driven as best we can to be able to meet those needs at home. And so we'll be happy to reach out to you in your office. And Ms. Secretary, just one last question. One worry that we have heard on the board in Colorado is that all areas of government, we're seeing federal dollars that are allocated for state distribution that do not make it out of the metropolitan areas into the rural areas. A lot of the grants, they'll go to our states. Unfortunately, sometimes they stay just in the large metropolitan areas. Do you see a better way to make sure that we're reaching all of the constituents and not discarding people that live in rural America?
Thank you for mentioning that. One of the reasons the opportunity zones were left up to the governors in each of the states is so that they could target some of the rural areas. As a result of that, about 40% of the opportunity zones are in rural areas. So I think that's going to be a tremendous help. Manufactured housing is also a big item in rural areas, twice as much as you find them in suburban and urban areas. So anything that we can do to enhance the manufactured housing industry is going to be helpful for the housing situation in rural areas.
Great. Thank you again for being here. I'm out of time. I'll yield back.
The gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver,
Thank you,
who's
Madam
also
Chair.
the chair for the Subcommittee on National Security, International Development, and Monetary Policy, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I'm glad you brought up the opportunity zone because that's kind of where I wanted to hang out for a few minutes. I've gone through the last iteration from the Treasury Department's rulemaking period, and I'm assuming that there's going to be some additional rules to come out. We have what they're calling it so far is general rules. So my concern, I've read everything that comes out on opportunity zones. And so my concern right now, I'm not sure, well, let me ask this way. What is HUD's role going to be? I mean, Treasury seems to be doing the rulemaking, and since there's no application process, how will HUD fit into all of this?
Well, 35 million Americans live in opportunity zones. 2.4 million HUD-assisted individuals live in opportunity zones. The household income in opportunity zones is about 37% below the state levels. High school graduation level, 22% don't graduate in opportunity zones versus 13% statewide. So what we're talking about are the people that HUD has a tendency to serve are in opportunity zones. That's the reason that HUD has been selected to chair the Opportunity and Revitalization Council, which consists of 16 federal agencies and federal state agencies, so they can focus their attention on the opportunity zones, remove the barriers quickly rather than having them go hither, thither, and yon. So obviously HUD will be playing a very significant role.
But the regulatory responsibility will remain with Treasury?
Remember, all the regulations come from a variety of different agencies. That's why we have 16 different ones. And we will be able to coordinate, focus their attention, and remove the regulations quickly that are necessary to be removed. Some regulations are important, and we recognize that.
So if an opportunity zone fund is presented with the investment, the capital gains taxes are placed in this fund, does a NOVA come from HUD or?
No, if you're talking about a tax issue, that would be Treasury.
So that the actual monitoring of it, this is a question I'm not, it would be at the end of the year. I mean, if you don't apply, if you go in and then you actually deal with it during the tax season. So I'm just hoping that there's not a situation where an opportunity fund is supposed to invest at least 90% of the money into the project, and let's say something goes awry, it's not going to be is not going to be known until at the end of the year. Is that right?
In terms of the financial consequences, perhaps. But we have an executive director who has an office so that we can get real-time feedback all the time so that the program can be changed as we roll it out.
Okay, that's the part I was not familiar with. Will the director be in HUD? Or will it?
The office is in HUD. Scott Turner is his name.
Okay. Do you have any idea when the final regulations, you know, when it first came out, we had a 2-pager, and so they were saying this is going to be the least regulated project, and then we got 2 or 3 weeks ago something pretty thick, and so I'm assuming that the final would be extremely thick or much thicker.
Yeah, most of the regulations have been put forward already in the first 2 tranches. The last tranche should be relatively small, and I think, you know, the rules are pretty well set out at this point, and a lot of money is coming in. A lot of activity is occurring.
Yes, we have. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Carson, for being here today. And in 2015, you wrote an op-ed titled "Experimenting with Failed Socialism Again" about the previously administration's affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. Under your leadership, HUD has committed to re-examining this rule. I want to thank you for being a strong capitalist, first of all, and for your service to this country. So can you elaborate on why a more socialist, heavy-handed government approach to fair housing would fail low-income individuals and minorities?
Yeah, well, you know, one of the reasons that I took this job is because I was very concerned about what was happening, particularly to a lot of disadvantaged people in our society, and that we, collectively, the government, were actually keeping people mired in poverty and dependency because we kept going down the same track, you know, whether we're Republicans or Democrats. And so we want to find ways that we can liberate people from those kinds of things. And all of our policies are really aimed at doing that. Affirmatively furthering fair housing, do I want to do that? Of course I want to do that. But you know, there was a system in place, an assessment tool, that basically just gave you statistics, you know, and created a big screen with purple dots and pink dots and green and yellow. So if you move some of the pink ones here and the yellow ones here, I'm not sure that that actually solves the problem. Why do you have segregation in housing? It's not because George Wallace is standing at the door blocking people. It's because people can only afford to live in certain places. So what we really need to do is ask ourselves, how do we liberate people from that? That's why we've been spending so much time and effort on looking at housing choice vouchers and how to make them more palatable. That's why we've been looking at ways to decrease the regulatory costs so that it's possible to build in other places, so we can build places like East Lake and purpose-built communities. That's why when we concentrate on community development, we concentrate not only on the houses, but on the schools, on grocery stores, on transportation, on all the things that allow people to thrive and move up. And that's why we try to create programs that enable people to become self-sufficient. That's why we provide the services and the information about the services, because it doesn't do good to have the services people don't know about them.
Opportunities are a good thing. There's been a lot of talk about the proposed rule that would prevent non-citizens from receiving taxpayer-funded federal housing assistance. We've talked already about that today. On May 15th, you received a letter from 12 Democrats that stated the following, and I quote, "The administration's approach to this proposed rulemaking runs counter to the goals of providing housing assistance to the most vulnerable Americans." I personally totally disagree with that. I define vulnerable Americans as a legal citizen who is not receiving any benefits at the cost of someone who is in the country illegally. So Secretary Carson, because of your knowledge of the wait list for these affected programs, I want you to give you the opportunity to justify this move of putting the needs of American citizens first.
Well, you know, it seems only logical that tax-paying American citizens should be taken care of first. It's just like when you get on an airplane and they make the announcement, in case of an emergency, oxygen mask will drop down, put yours on first, and then help your neighbor. It's the same concept. And it's not that we're cruel and mean-hearted, it's that we are logical. This is common sense. You take care of your own first. And it's also common sense that you ask yourself, why are you having all of these kinds of problems? And the answer to that is because we won't deal with the underlying problem. And until we're willing, you know, collectively, both Democrats and Republicans, to sit down and solve the problem, we're going to continue to have these problems crop up continually. And why would we be fighting the symptoms when we can get to the root cause of the problem?
Real quick, have illegal immigrants been able to exploit the whole HUD's regulations, and are you confident that you'll be able to fix this issue?
I think that we can fix this. We now have the SAVE system through DHS, which allows us to identify people quickly. This was not the case when this rule was put in place.
Thanks for your testimony.
The gentleman from California, Mr. Vargas, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you, Doctor, for being here. I appreciate it. I do want to continue on the question of my friend from Texas. One of the things that wasn't mentioned here, and I'm a little bit surprised you haven't mentioned it, is actually if a person's undocumented in a household, the aid is prorated. So the person who's undocumented actually doesn't get any subsidy. It's the child. It's the American citizen child that is in fact helped. That's one of the things that wasn't mentioned here. I thought it would have been up to now. Because again, the law as it currently stands and the rules say this, that those children that are American citizens, they're helped, again, by Americans, even though I would go, of course, and extend it further as a Christian. I don't make the difference between someone who is undocumented or not. But the rules as they are today say, no, we only take care of the child. That has not been brought up in all of this conversation. It should have been. My understanding, that's the rule today. Sir, am I incorrect about that?
You're not incorrect. And also, interestingly enough, prorating. How do you prorate a roof over somebody's head?
By the number of people who are in there, you're taking care of the child, and you do, in fact, prorate it against anyone who's ineligible because of their legal status or for some other reason. But the child is an American citizen. And those 55,000 children are going to be somehow thrown out into the street or something else. In fact, your agency itself, you guys determined, your analysts, that it was going to be more expensive to the federal government if this rule goes forward. That's not our determination. My understanding, that's your determination.
It is our determination. I thank you for making that point, because the reason it would be more expensive is because the people who are on the waiting list are even more needy than the ones who are in there. So yes, we do need to take care of it. But as I mentioned before, I would love to be able to take care of everybody, but we have to do this within the framework of the law. And if people don't like the law, they should change it.
Well, we do have a rule, actually, that takes care of it today. I have to say, you did quote, and I appreciate you quoted Proverbs 17, and I believe it goes, there's a second part to that. I believe
29:18.
29:18, yeah. I believe it, the second part says something like, and those who, where there is no vision, the people perish, but happy is the man who follows the law, for he is joyful, something like that. Mm-hmm. There's also Proverbs 29 is one of my favorite, also 7, I believe, goes something like, the righteous care about the justice for the poor, but the wicked have no such concern. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't believe you're wicked in any way. In fact, I think you're trying to figure out how to propose something to push reform, and I don't necessarily disagree with that.
Yes.
And I don't believe that this rule could have come from you. I was there in 2013 when you spoke at the National Prayer Breakfast. I go every Thursday to the prayer breakfast, and I was the national co-chair for 1 year. I don't think you're mean-spirited at all. I disagree with some of your policies, but I have to say, taking these 55,000 children and putting them on the street, I do think is mean-spirited. I don't think it's your nature. I hope you review that.
It's not my nature to want to put anybody out on the street, and that's why we provided the 18-month period.
Well, I hope and pray that you rethink that. Again, I don't agree with all your policies, but I certainly in no way challenge your view of humanity and that you've been a good person and tried to do the right thing. I hope you review that. I do want to ask about DACA recipients also. My understanding has been that DACA recipients have been eligible for FHA loans, and in fact, I want to quote you, make sure this quote is correct. I asked around after I read the story, and that is that DACA recipients were being denied FHA loans by HUD instructions. No one was aware of any changes that have been made to the policy whatsoever. I'm sure we have plenty of DACA recipients who have FHA loans. So are you familiar with any changes? Have you made any changes?
No, it's, the same policy has been in place since 2003, which was reaffirmed in 2015 by the previous administration. And we have not made any changes to that whatsoever.
Thank you. I hope that that becomes clear out there in the community. Again, I thank you for being here. Again, we disagree on some issues, but I appreciate your openness also towards comprehensive immigration reform.
Thank you for
God
being
bless
able
you.
to disagree without being disagreeable.
Thank you.
The gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Waters. Mr. Secretary, glad to have you back before the committee.
Thank you.
Very pleased you made your second trip back to the 2nd Congressional District in Arkansas. We appreciate you coming to our state fair lending and fair housing conference, and I heard a lot of positive remarks about your comments. And we want to have you back as we explore the opportunity zones. We had Senator Scott down in the district, and what's interesting is one of the opportunity zones also abuts one of our historically black colleges and universities, Philander Smith. And to me, that's really a really interesting opportunity because not only has the president asked you to work on the opportunity zone issue, he's also empowered the HBCU executive order to try to maximize all federal resources to enhance the position of our historically black colleges and universities. So this could be a really interesting opportunity. When you were in Little Rock 2 years ago, you visited with Our House, which is a housing homeless holistic approach. We don't separate sort of the moral from the economic there, to paraphrase Arthur Brooks. It's a holistic approach to education and health care and child care, as well as getting people lifted up and back to productive life. And they were very interested in potentially being an Envision Center partner to a local public housing authority. Will there be another cohort where public housing authorities can offer proposals for partnership?
Yes. You know, we have a real operator in place now when it comes to spreading those programs. So the initial cohort was really to gain some information on how to do this and make it work effectively. So yes, that will be happening.
Good. Another area I've also listened to in my district relates to our local public housing authorities and their certification of landowners for use in Section 8 vouchers. And one of my city council members, Doris Wright, and I toured a apartment complex that, while it's also got a good mentorship program with a local church that helps with child care and mentoring the residents there, the conditions are just deplorable, meaning the physical conditions. Can you follow up maybe in writing with what the standards are that a city council, local city council, should hold the local public housing authority to on certifying that a landowner is qualified for receiving a Section 8 voucher?
I think we can get that information to you.
It's
no question about it. But you know, we do trust to some degree the landowners to be, you know, reasonable people and have some concern for the people. And we do have some degree of oversight, but there are legal remedies for people who abuse the tenants as well.
Yeah, this is a pretty rough, and I'm not passing judgment either. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a HUD inspector, but when you do a cruise through this particular complex and look at some of the conditions of the units, one might question whether or not they are eligible for Section 8 money.
Right.
We've had a lot of talk about overcrowding today and issues, and we passed legislation here in the Congress. I was shocked when I first came to the Congress that New York, a big city with a big demand for public housing, I think had a waiting list in something like 500,000 units. And yet there were tens of thousands of units that people were occupying that were making too much money to be qualified to be in public housing. And so Congress, in the last couple of years, reacted. I think President Trump signed that into law. Are we doing a better job making sure if you're earning too much money that you're have opportunities elsewhere to live so that we can make room for some of these long waiting lists?
Well, we're trying to create an environment where people feel freer to exit, the supported housing. And, it's a sort of a catch-22 because we have also gotten into a situation where when people begin to climb the ladder, we pull the ladder out from underneath them. And then everybody else is watching that, and they say, I'm not climbing that ladder. So we have to be a little careful about the way that we do that, allowing people to exit in a way that they will be able to continue climbing that ladder and that they feel comfortable going out there. And those are the kind of programs that we have to be creating.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentlewoman from Ohio, Mrs. Beatty, who is also the chair of the Subcommittee on Diversity and Inclusion, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and to Mr. Secretary. I have several questions, and because of our 5-minute time period, I'm going to try to get through them at rapid speed. As you know, you were here before, and I'm going to ask you the same question that I've asked every one of your colleagues, and I am very hopeful that you can give me a yes on this. Are you familiar with Amway and what it is?
With who?
Amway.
Amway?
Amway. Come on, Mr. Secretary. Now, I asked you this when you were here last year, and you asked me to be nice to you, and you turned to your staff, Amway, and you have an Amway director. And we wrote you a letter about it, and Amway, Office of Minority Women and Inclusion. Do you have an Amway director? Do you work with an Amway director?
Well, of course we have an Office of
Amway, not Amway, Amway.
We have.
Do you know who that person is?
We have.
Do you know who that person is?
I cannot give you the name.
Okay. Would you do me a favor? Would you find out, and would you send me a note back so we don't ever have to repeat this again?
We can send you a note on that.
Okay. Thank you. I've had a lot of individuals from my district, a group of people who are here today in the audience who have questions about FSS. Are you familiar with that program?
Family self-sufficiency?
Yes.
Yes.
So one of the questions is what measures are instituted to ensure public housing residents have fair and equal access to FSS?
Well, anybody who comes and applies for it or asks for it, unless there's any particular reason to deny it. The problem is not so much that people are denied access to it as that we don't have enough people asking for it.
Okay. So the next part, I represent Columbus, Ohio, and I am very proud of my public housing authority. And I meet with them on a regular basis. As you know, I've spent more than 20-some years working in public housing and relocation. One of the things that my president and CEO asked me to ask you about is increased funding for FSS to allow them to grow the program to serve more families, both in public housing and in Section 8. It is my understanding that much of the money goes for staffing versus service. So I'd like to ask you if you would look into that to see what we could do with that program. And I can also tell you, and Madam Chairwoman, I'd like to enter this document into the records. It is about my district. All politics are local. We have an outstanding FSS program where we've had successful graduates. We've had in individual financial counseling some 116 people. And-
Without objection, the item is entered into the record.
Thank you. The other question is, now that you've had more time to think, on the CDBG, my colleague, Congressman Scott, asked you about those funds. Have you had more time to think that you would certainly not cut those funds, or is that something you want us to get an answer from after you consult with your team?
I have an answer for it. Wasn't given an opportunity to finish it. First of all, let me just say with Columbus, a tremendous job with transitional housing.
Thank you.
One of the best in the country. As far as CDBG, as I was saying, it has done a lot of good things. The problem is the formula is sometimes inappropriate. For instance, it says, you know, to give this money to this group if the houses were built before 1940. Well, a lot of those houses are like million-dollar mansions.
Okay, and I'm gonna hate to interrupt you, but my time is running. I have just one more question.
So the program needs to be modified.
Okay, thank you. Also, I was talking with some friends and colleagues, as we look at the number of teens couch surfing, the number of single moms, would you be interested in having a dialogue with community leaders? I've talked to people who run programs like Susan Taylor's program, like public housing, and they feel we should be doing more creative things in helping our young folks in the housing areas, which helps them with their entire lifestyle. Would you be interested in doing something like that?
We're very interested in that. Had an opportunity to do some of that with Senator Collins in Maine recently. It's an area that we need attention, and Jean Lynn Powell is the person who heads up the Office of Small and Disadvantaged Business Utilization.
Thank you.
Gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Kustoff, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for coming today. We've had a number of members. Thank you for coming to their district. I also thank you for coming to Memphis and to West Tennessee last year. I've met with constituents who have an interest in strengthening the low-income housing tax credit. And in the last Congress, I think that there was a bill, the Affordable Housing Credit. The tax credit, in my opinion, it's a vital source for affordable housing. You've stated in the past that HUD has taken steps to streamline projects that utilize this particular tax credit. Can you expand on that, Secretary Carson?
Well, the LIHTC, Low Income Housing Tax Credit, is probably responsible for the largest number of new affordable housing in the country. So obviously we're interested in it. Traditionally, it has about an $8 billion budget that has been provided to Treasury for that program. Utilizing that along with the RAD program, along with the monies that will be coming through opportunity zones, provide us with an unprecedented opportunity, not only to accrete affordable housing, but really to expand the economic opportunities and business opportunities, which then have a domino effect in terms of creating other economic activity around them.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Last Congress, when the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act was introduced, it seemed to have pretty good bipartisan support. One of the provisions in the bill would have created a 4% credit rate, permanent rate, and further credit expansion. What are your thoughts on a permanent 4% credit rate?
For individuals or for communities?
For both.
Well, obviously, we want to expand credit in a responsible way as much as we possibly can, being cognizant of the fact that when we do it inappropriately, we actually aren't doing people any favors. We're actually making their lives more difficult when that happens. So any ideals that you have for appropriate expansion of credit, we're always going to be in the market for doing that. Our FHA Commissioner, Bryant Montgomery, is very open to that concept as well.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. There have been a number of questions today asked about community development block grants. And in my district and in Memphis and in West Tennessee, these block grants have been, in the past, they've been used successfully. Given that the CDBG program was put into place during the Ford administration, we could probably look at modernizing the program to some extent. What are your thoughts about modernizing CDBG to better incentivize, if you will, and streamlining permitting processes and other policies that may create barriers to development projects?
Sure, there are about 1,210 communities now that benefit from the CDBG program, and they're the only ones. I think it really should be a much more competitive program. I think there are a lot of things that could be done so that we really target the low and moderate income people the way it was supposed to be done. It's been, just abused, quite frankly. I would be very open to modernizing it and working with Congress to get that done.
If I could, as it relates to the funding portion and what's known as Formula B, which is in part based on data from pre-1940 housing. I know that there's some communities that benefit from Formula B. There's some that obviously are harmed by it. Would HUD look at looking at Formula B to maybe modernizing it or better utilizing it for other communities to tap into that formula?
Absolutely, and I think a lot of other communities would be absolutely delighted. And it's not that I'm against the concept of why it was created. We're more against what it has become.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Madam Chairman. I yield back my time.
The gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Thank you, Secretary Carson, for coming before this committee. I'm not sure if you remember the first time we met, but it was in the gymnasium of Southwestern High School, our alma mater. I was excited that you took time to come and speak to the young people there. You walked the same hallways I did, that those very young people did. You grew up in the same challenged neighborhoods. Secretary Carson, instead of helping the very community you grew up in, you've decided to dial back on protections and resources that help those in need, that stop housing discrimination. This is happening while measures are being put in place to criminalize and surveil those that are our very residents that we serve. And Secretary Carson, I commend you. I commend HUD in recently suing Facebook for the use of facial recognition technology. When asked about this lawsuit, you stated, quote, using a computer to limit a person's housing choices can be just as discriminatory as slamming a door in someone's face. Yes or no, did you benefit from Section 8 housing?
Did I what?
Benefit from Section 8 housing?
No, I did not.
You didn't? Okay, I do have quotes from the past, I think when you were running for President of the United States, that you did claim that you did receive some sort of voucher or Section 8 housing.
I never claimed that.
That's okay.
Other people claimed it, not
Oh,
me.
I understand. Apologize. Would you be okay with facial recognition technology being used by law enforcement and other agencies in the neighborhoods that you grew up in, including public housing?
I think, we obviously have to adjust with the technology as it is rapidly advancing. It can be abused, and of course, that's one of our jobs to make sure it is not.
So Secretary Carson, are you aware of Project Greenlight in Detroit?
Where the mayor is putting up the lights to decrease
Well, in Detroit, the
crime.
Project Greenlight enables police to identify and track residents captured on hundreds of private and public cameras. The same surveillance has since expanded to include lower income housing. Are you aware that Detroit Housing Commission that receives funding from HUD is currently moving towards using Project Greenlight's facial recognition technology for public housing?
I think the project has done some great good. The mayor has told me that it's solved a lot of the crime problems and brought it down. Doesn't mean that we don't have to be very careful about how that technology is used in the future.
So you don't oppose the use of it?
I'm not saying I oppose the inappropriate use of it.
Okay. Well, currently, my colleague Rep. Presley and I are introducing a bill that bans the use of real-time facial recognition technology in federal funded housing. And I hope that maybe your department can take a look at it and maybe help us move that forward so there is no abuse and intentional discrimination towards those of color. Secretary Carson, the neighborhood that you grew up in, the one that really believed in you and I before anyone else did, is very much hurting because they've been feeling left behind. I believe 71% of them, especially in the state of Michigan, spend more than half of their income on housing costs and utilities. The conditions in HUD housing is getting worse with continued decrease in funding while backlogs for affordable housing grows. That day at Southwestern High School, do you remember what you told us?
I don't remember now.
You said something pretty spectacular, and it was very inspiring. You said that no matter if you are poor, you can succeed. This seems very hard for our people, Secretary Carson, today, because the same programs that helped you and I are being scaled back. It is your turn to give back, for you to remember where you came from and use your experience growing up poor in Detroit. Lastly, you keep saying we are a nation of laws. I hope, Secretary Carson, that you and my colleagues who agreed with you in that statement would also apply that to the President of the United States. Madam Chairman, I ask for this article titled Controversial Surveillance Program Coming to Detroit Public Housing to be submitted for the record, and I yield the rest of my time. Thank you, Secretary.
Without objection, such is the order. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Zeldin, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your service, past, present, and future to our country. First, before I ask a question, I just want to point out the reason why you wouldn't recognize the term OMWI in HUD is that HUD doesn't have OMWI. Dodd-Frank doesn't require OMWI. There are other agencies that have it. As you point out, you have the Office of Small and Disadvantaged Business Utilization, which seeks to accomplish many of the same goals, but pretty unfair question to ask you who the director is of an entity that obviously doesn't exist within HUD. So my apologies on behalf of
thank you for clarifying that.
my colleague. In my district, I talk to potential homeowners and the realtors and lenders who serve them, and one thing I hear over and over again is how otherwise credit-worthy, hardworking families can't get into a new home because they aren't liquid enough to make that big down payment, even though they can otherwise afford to pay a mortgage. That is why the FHA loan is so essential to Long Island families looking to purchase a new home that will help them build their own version of the American dream and, most importantly, help them stay on Long Island. These are middle-class people with good jobs and good credit scores, but maybe they aren't liquid enough to put up a large down payment in a region with some of the highest real estate values in the nation. Over the past several years, we've seen traditional lenders like banks, which are subject to stringent capital requirements and are well regulated, flee FHA lending as a result of the use of the False Claims Act to pursue them for allegedly, quote, defective loans. The False Claims Act was passed by the Lincoln administration to prevent horse theft and other fraud during the Civil War, but a century and a half later is being exploited by frivolous lawyers, and these unfair lawsuits are scaring lenders out of the FHA market. Overzealous enforcement of the law by the previous administration encouraged this bad behavior instead of reining it in. A misplaced comma or a staple on a stack of mortgage paperwork should not be grounds for a massive lawsuit against an honest lender who is helping someone get an FHA loan. For many reasons, these lawsuits, or just the threat of these lawsuits, have negative ramifications for FHA and Ginnie Mae and are hurting access to affordable housing in my district and nationwide. What are you doing to bring traditional lenders back into this important program?
Well, thank you for that question, and thank you for the work that you're doing in your district in New York, and I've enjoyed our visits in the past. We've been working very closely with the Office of the Attorney General and with the Justice Department because we recognize that they also have issues and they want to make sure that people don't get away with things. But the problem is that it's been much too difficult to sort out, what's the defect and what is not. So, we have, re-examined the defect taxonomy and finding ways that we can clarify for everybody easily and bring this into the digital realm. so that it's not just somebody sitting behind a desk. And it makes it much easier if we use technology, IT, to just get rid of a lot of the immaterial mistakes and not have them count toward any untoward action for that person.
Thank you for your work on this issue, very important for my district, and I know that you and your team are laser focused on it, which really is something that my constituents are grateful for. Something that's very personal to us, the issue of veterans homelessness, and I want to thank you for your personal efforts on this particular issue. It's a huge challenge, and any veteran who raises their hand willing to lay down their life in defense of our freedoms and liberties should have food on their table, a roof over their head, shoes on their feet, and anything that you can do, and really working with this committee, working with the chairwoman, the ranking member, and working with you as well. If we can pursue any new victories during this Congress to help get our veterans, just like we really want to get as a goal, really want to get every American off of the streets. Right. The one that certainly is most personal is when that person deploys in the combat and they come home and they're on the street, which is outrageous. So I thank you for your work on the veterans homelessness issue. I appreciate that HUD and the DOJ are working together because regulatory clarity on the issue that we just discussed is essential here so we can make sure bad government policy isn't putting up roadblocks to hardworking American families who are pursuing the dream of home ownership. And I yield back.
Thank you.
The gentleman from Utah, Mr. McAdams, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Carson, thank you for being here today. Mr. Secretary, would you generally agree that policymakers make better policy decisions when they consider all data and facts before making a decision?
Yes.
And would you also agree that it's important for policymakers to be transparent and hear from interested persons that may be affected by a particular policy?
Yes.
In fact, I'm happy to hear that. It's even in HUD's policy statement, 24 CFR section 10.1, so it's great to hear these answers from you, and I agree. Mr. Secretary, in my home state of Utah, housing prices continue to climb dramatically, as in many places around the country. And our area is facing a shortage of thousands of homes. Just for reference, the median sales price of a new home in Salt Lake County in 2018 was up 61% from the median price in 2010. 3 other Wasatch Front counties have had similar rates of increase. And since 2010, new households in Utah have outnumbered new housing units. So that's new households created have outnumbered new housing units by over 40,000, which explains a lot the cost increases of housing. Because of this, HUD's mission of supporting affordable housing access and affordable housing development is vitally important to me and to my constituents. So I want to specifically ask you about a recent HUD action that may make it harder for low and moderate income individuals to be able to purchase a home. Mr. Secretary, last month, FHA issued a mortgage letter claiming to clarify documentation requirements for loans originated that have down payment assistance from governmental entities. That mortgagee letter, however, issued new requirements for a number of entities, many of whom had been originating mortgages for years and suddenly were no longer able to do so. The result of this is that low and moderate income individuals in my district and in many districts around the country may no longer be able to purchase a home with no longer having access to some of these programs. And I understand that this policy is currently under litigation, so I respect that you probably can't discuss the details of this litigation, but I wanted to talk to you some about the process, which I think you can discuss. Mr. Secretary, what formal process and public comment period did HUD or FHA undertake before FHA issued this mortgagee letter?
I'm not aware of a public process.
That is absolutely correct. There was no public process. Mr. Secretary, HUD previously announced that it would address governmental down payment assistance programs through a rulemaking in both the 2018 spring and fall regulatory agendas. What changed at HUD to warrant a decision not to advance rulemaking and instead to just issue this guidance through a mortgagee letter?
I think it was the feeling of those involved that it was creating damage to people, and that they wanted them to understand what the parameters of being able to offer this kind of assistance were, and that it should be done within one's own jurisdiction. That it tended to metastasize outside of one's jurisdiction is when the problems began to occur.
But again, I would go back to the HUD's policy statement that policymakers make better decisions when they consider all data and facts before making a decision, and that it would be important to include policymakers and other interested persons before adopting a particular policy. And that's why I think I was disappointed, especially with the negative impacts, understanding that there may be rational reasons for looking at this, but the negative impacts of proceeding with the mortgagee letter before doing a formal rulemaking as had been previously promised.
Your point is well taken.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. It's also my understanding that the mortgagee letter may negatively affect tribal governmental entities more than it would affect other housing finance agencies. Do you have any evidence that these DPA loans are performing worse than other DPA loans?
I'm not familiar with the data that was used.
I think that's because there is no data. HUD does not collect taxpayer IDs that differentiate between a tribal HFA and a non-tribal HFA. So, Mr. Secretary, I appreciate the role that you must play in protecting taxpayers and the MMIF, but if you do not currently collect the appropriate data to judge the success of a DPA program, then perhaps we should collect that data before moving forward with this policy. I yield back.
I agree with you, actually.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope if you do agree, I hope that maybe we can revisit this and look at engaging the public in a process before continuing. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Gonzalez, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Dr. Carson, for being here and for your attention and for all your service to the country. I want to start by first commending you for taking on Facebook and uncovering what I think most Americans, if they knew the details of, would be sickened by. Could you just briefly sort of describe what you found and kind of give an update as to the status of the investigation?
Well, as you know, it's in federal court now, so I can't do too much. But I will say, in general, that they're able to collect enormous amounts of information about people. People have no idea that it's being collected. The real problem is when you use that information to discriminate against people, to either deny information to them or to send information only to selected groups of people based on the various demographic data that you collect. And this is just going to become a progressive problem if we don't nip it in the bud. So, you know, I see this as something that's going to be very important in our society.
Absolutely. Would it be fair to say that what you found was essentially that if you're somebody, let's say you're a realtor, and you want to target ads on Facebook, that you could essentially completely lock out individuals based on race, gender, zip code, basically anything you want using the data and tools that Facebook provides?
Correct.
I would consider that, quite frankly, some of the most aggressive redlining this country's ever seen. It's redlining in the digital age.
Technical redlining.
Technical redlining in the digital age, and I again want to commend you for your work in cracking down on this
Thank you.
Abusive practice. You sort of alluded to in your first response that this problem's going to become more profound. I agree with you as more of our lives move to the digital realm. Could you talk a little bit about any discussions that you've had internally or investigations that you're undertaking or thinking of undertaking with respect to Twitter and Google and sort of additional platform security?
Well, we've been in contact with them and you know, asked for certain information from them and you know, reserve the right to pursue it further depending on what the investigations show.
Great, and I look forward to following that because again, I think it's incredibly important. You know, there was a point when we thought that these platforms were essentially going to be liberation technologies, and it wasn't that long ago. And I think what we've seen over time is that in the wrong hands, bad actors can use them for very nefarious methods.
Absolutely.
And again, I commend you for it. Last question, and I'll just kind of turn it over to you. Is there anything that you want to share with the committee that you haven't quite had a chance to with respect to the ongoing work at HUD?
Yeah. I share from my heart, my concern about our country. We have a very strong country, and the only people who can bring us down are ourselves. If we continue to allow ourselves to be made into enemies instead of being able to use our collective abilities and talents to focus on the problems that we have and to solve those problems. These are things that we are capable of doing. This is America. It's a great nation. And you look back at the early part of our country, a lot of people were critical of us. They said, you got the Fords and the Kellogg's and the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts and all these people with all this money, and then you got all the poor people. You can't have a government like that. You got to have an overarching government that equitably redistributes everything. What they didn't realize is that those people that I just named in our country, instead of just being greedy and passing money down from one generation to the next, what they did is built the Transcontinental Railroad and the seaports and the textile mills and the factories that allowed us to have the most dynamic middle class the world has ever known, which rapidly propelled us to the pinnacle of the world. They didn't stop there. They built schools and universities and libraries and museums and things that really helped to create the American dream. And it's about providing opportunities for our fellow citizens, because our most precious resource are our people. And if we develop our people, we will be successful.
Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman, and thank you, Secretary Carson, for joining us today. Secretary Carson, in December 2017, you delivered a keynote at the Manhattan Institute where you stated, quote, "The war on poverty sometimes conflicted with the war on drugs, which often dealt harshly with nonviolent offenders, taking men away from their families and disproportionately affecting minority communities." Are these your words?
Yes.
Do you acknowledge that the war on drugs disproportionately impacted Black communities and communities of color, despite marijuana and other drug use levels being comparable to white communities?
Traditionally, that has been the case.
And I see here, are you also aware that when a formerly incarcerated person is homeless, there's a 60% chance that they will be rearrested? But if that same person has access to housing, the percentage drops to 29%.
Housing is one of the factors that is beneficial in preventing recidivism.
Mm-hmm. I'm concerned here that the war on drugs has not been solely limited to incarceration, and that the negative impact of the war on drugs has not been limited to incarceration. But also we had legislated rippling effects that also seems to have been codified in our housing system. Are you aware of HUD's one-strike rule, which evicts tenants for a single incidence of criminal activity, no matter how minor, with no holistic review?
There is the ability of local jurisdictions to alter that rule.
Mm-hmm. But federally, this provision still persists, correct?
As far as I know, it's still intact.
Mm-hmm. And so a person could be stop and frisked and be found in possession of a small amount of marijuana and then be evicted or have their entire family evicted from public housing.
That is a possibility.
Are you aware that owners and public housing authorities can subject tenants to tests for alcohol and drugs?
They can require that, yes.
Mm-hmm. And I see here that we also have no-fault policies where an entire family can be evicted for the criminal activity of a guest of the household, even without the knowledge of anyone in that household. Are you aware of that provision as well?
The use of such activity is extremely limited, if ever used.
Mm-hmm. But they are still codified in federal law, correct?
Is it on the federal books? As far as I know, it's been on the books for many, many years.
Mm-hmm. Do you support reversing some of these provisions?
Do I Which provisions?
Say the no-fault policy.
I can talk about that on individual cases if you have an example that you want to talk about.
Well, I'd say, would you support being able to move some of these policies over to a more holistic review? You know, you yourself asked for case-by-case consideration. Should that case-by-case consideration be codified in federal law instead of having blanket one-strike or no-fault policies?
I'm always in favor of more flexibility.
Well, I'm happy to hear that, Secretary Carson. I'd also like to highlight there's been much talk about the issue with NYCHA and public housing, and it's horrifying, the conditions that are happening in NYCHA. It's horrifying that people are living through winter without heat, opening their ovens to try to make sure that they're able to sleep through the night. But I think it's important to notice that this is not about throwing more money to the problem. This is about throwing the money at the problem. NYCHA and public housing across the country has been starved by members of Congress for over 15 years, and that deficit has built up for many, many years, which has led to, in New York City alone, a $32 billion price tag to make sure that we get people basic heat, hot water, and so on. And I don't think that, no matter what policy changes we make, you can't take food away from a child and then not understand why they can't or don't eat. And I think that that's exactly what's happening with our public housing program. Chairwoman, I would like to seek unanimous consent to submit to the record a New York Times article on what it would take to fix New York's public housing.
Without objection, such is the order.
Thank you very much. And I'd also like to make of note that the provisions that we wanted to reverse, including one strike and no fault policies, are being introduced in our bill on the Fair Chance at Housing Act. Thank you very much.
The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Rose, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Waters, and thank you, Secretary Carson, for being with us today and for your frank testimony today. I can't help but acknowledge your great personal life story as I began today, and know that you came up under very tough circumstances, and through the leadership of folks like your mother, you were able to overcome those. I'm wondering, though, as you've now had a couple of years in government service and as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, do you find the challenges in serving in this way to be tougher than those that you experienced as a neurosurgeon, very successfully tackling many problems?
Well, I can tell you as a neurosurgeon, the operating room was a haven. You could go in there and get away from all the problems of the world. But, it's one of the great things about medicine is you were able to intervene in people's lives and give them a second chance. And, despite the difficulties of this job and the attacks and criticism, there is an opportunity to change people's lives, to change the trajectory of our nation, to change the way that we do things, to go from just taking care of people to actually setting people on a trajectory towards success.
You talked earlier about the situation where, due to planned improvements in public housing, sometimes people are displaced, and how very often they find that after they've moved on, they find a better solution. I wonder if there's any lessons that you may have learned or the department may have learned from seeing that might help guide us toward helping people move beyond public housing.
Well, the key thing that I've seen is when we develop communities in a holistic way, it almost doesn't matter where they are. You provide the substance for what people need in order to develop. One of the things I learned from the HUD-VASH program, this is for veterans and veteran homelessness. HUD provides the housing, the VA provides the wraparound services. It doesn't work when we just give them housing. It doesn't work when we just give them wraparound services, but when we put both together, have a tremendous impact in terms of getting those veterans back to being self-sufficient again. That's the same policy that we want to use today for the people who are being assisted in housing.
In Tennessee, we have a very successful Housing Finance Agency, the Tennessee Development Housing Agency, THDA, because THDA is highly integrated into local communities and have staff who understand both national programs and state-run programs, they are able to have great success in prudently and affordably and affordable housing folks in the 6th District and Tennessee in general. They do not utilize a one-size-fits-all approach. Instead, they tailor their work to the best help the individual constituent. I tend to think that local problems often require local solutions. In fact, they usually do. The housing issues in Memphis are not the same as the ones in Nashville, just like the issues in New York City are not the same as for my constituents in the 6th District of Tennessee. For example, manufactured housing may not make sense in Manhattan, but they are significant or an integral part of rural housing in Tennessee. How can we best leverage these state finance agencies in trying to address the affordable housing shortage in our country?
Well, I think we just have to keep an open mind, as you said, recognizing that the needs are going to be different in every different district. We also need to concentrate on modernizing our building techniques. And June 1 through 5, there will actually be a showcase of new housing techniques on the National Mall. I invite all of you to come to it. 3D printed housing, manufactured housing, all kinds of new techniques and materials, some of which cost considerably less than what we're doing now. Integrating those kinds of things into our housing policy, I think, is going to be something that will help us out tremendously.
Do you share my view that local problems require local solutions? And as a country, we need to take responsibility at the community and local level rather than simply solving every problem by spending more and more federal dollars?
I not only share it, but I enthusiastically endorse it. It has to be all of us working together, not pointing fingers at each other, but working together.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ms. Adams, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Secretary Carson, for being here today. I'm over here. We've had some discussion today about the choice vouchers, and many public housing agencies have wait lists. In my district in Charlotte, North Carolina, Mecklenburg, we've got more than 30,000 people who are on the wait list for a housing choice voucher. That includes women and children and families, people with disabilities, seniors, young people, and the list goes on. Just if you can just give me a yes or no to this, because I have a couple other questions. Do you believe that the federal government is dedicating enough funding and resources to ensure that individuals who are most in need of housing can access an affordable place to live?
Would I love to be able to give a lot more? Of course.
Okay, thank you. So given the severe shortage of public housing and federal rental assistance, why did the budget request for FY 2020 zero out programs like CDBG, Public Housing Capital Fund, Home, and you only asked for $8.7 billion less than 2019?
Because we have to make tough choices in a budget, because we have a $22 billion deficit, debt, and we have children and grandchildren and people who will be coming after that who will be responsible for that. So real compassion includes them as well.
Okay. So is there any, when we talk about the housing choice vouchers, was there any reason that you didn't ask for more funding for that?
Exactly the same reason. Okay. Would I love to be able to have enough for everybody to have one? That'd be great.
Okay, let me ask this question in terms of the vouchers. We have, in 2016, we had 127 people in Charlotte that received the voucher. 45 of those expired. So that means that individuals who were searching for housing, they were doing that for 120 days, because I understand it's 4 months. And so they're going to have to give them back. They've been turned away because landlords and property managers don't want to rent to folks with Section 8 vouchers. And so I think that there may be some income source discrimination. I think that's unfair, and that's simple. You know, it's just plain and simple that that's unfair. So Given this data, do you believe that we need a federal law prohibiting this income discrimination?
I think we certainly need to be looking at what are the impediments for people to accept those vouchers, and that's exactly what we're doing right now. If we go through that process and it's still a problem, maybe a federal law may be necessary.
Okay, what about in terms of the folks who are having to give them back? Is there a way to extend the time frame? I mean, 4 months obviously is not enough in some cases.
There are hardship exemptions in existence which can be utilized in those situations.
Okay, since I've got a few more minutes, since you've rolled back the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, what specific actions is HUD currently taking to ensure its guarantees are fulfilling their fair housing obligations to tackle segregation and housing discrimination?
Well, when I took office, there were 602 discriminatory actions. We're down to about 100 now. We've gone through all of those. And in addition to taking care of the new ones that have come in, we get about 8,000 a year. So we have been extremely active in pursuing those. And I've made it very clear to all the organizations, if anybody knows of discriminatory activity that's going on that we're not already addressing, please let us know.
Okay. Have you received any complaints at this point?
Like I said, we get about 8,000 a year, and we deal with them as they come in.
Okay. Do you know about how many you've resolved?
The resolution is about 80%.
Okay. Thank you. Madam Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Still, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Waters, and thank you, Secretary Carson, for coming today. I want to talk to you about opportunity zones. Okay. In southeast Wisconsin, we have a handful of opportunity zones, in particular in the cities of Janesville, Racine, and Kenosha. There's a lot of opportunity in these opportunity zones, and people are quite excited about the possibilities that they bring to bring rejuvenation into these cities. Could you comment on what you're working on at HUD in supporting qualified opportunity fund investments in housing?
Yeah, we actually have a lot of components that are working on this. For instance, when it comes to economic empowerment and development, the Commerce Department is spearheading the activity. When it comes to entrepreneurship, small business is spearheading the activity. When it comes to education and workforce development, both the Labor Department and Education Department. When it comes to safe communities and environmental concerns, the Department of Justice is spearheading that. And when it comes to assessment of what's going on and measurement, the Council of Economic Advisors is spearheading that. So we have a number of different spearheads tackling the problem.
I appreciate that, and I would ask you if your schedule permits some time to come to Southeast Wisconsin and explore firsthand what opportunity these opportunity zones present to some of the communities in the area that I have the privilege of being a voice for. I would love to. I've
been there before, Racine in particular, at SC Johnson. Good things going on there.
We would love to have you back. I want to shift gears in my limited time and talk about state and local barriers to development. And so, Secretary Carson, many of my colleagues seem to believe that the answer to our housing is simply in the amount of money we spend. But I think we're coming to a bipartisan consensus it's emerging that we're recognizing also the role of state and local barriers to development, in particular those that are restricting access to housing. Right. Strict land use laws in places in particular like New York and San Francisco and Los Angeles are making it hard to deliver affordable housing. And this is pricing low-income families out of their neighborhoods. It makes it hard for the striving young people to move to a place where jobs are actually plentiful. Can you talk about the high regulatory costs and how it's making it harder for HUD in local housing authorities to serve those in need?
Yeah, well, you know, when you look at zoning regulations, for instance, you take a place like Los Angeles, 70 to 80% of the land is zoned for single-family housing with a certain amount of property. And then you throw on top of that all the regulatory barriers, including recently the need for some solar input. Are you kidding me? This just piles up, and that's why you see people who make $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a year living on the street in tents. This can be resolved, but it needs to be resolved with federal, state, and local authorities. I understand that Mayor Garcetti has recently begun to look at allowing accessory dwelling units, and which will certainly help the situation. Those are the kinds of things, though, that we have to be looking at. We can, as I said before, we can solve this problem. If we don't make it political, let's just use what we have and solve it.
I appreciate those comments. It's an incredibly important topic, and we need to continue to look at the local aspect of these land zoning rules that are driving up the cost of housing in very particular communities in the United States. And I appreciate your time today. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Gottheimer, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Waters, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here today.
Thank you.
One of the issues that I'm particularly focused on is the tightening of the credit box. I know that you and my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, we all agree that we need to expand access to credit in a responsible manner so that those who deserve to be in a home can be. We also know that HUD plays a critical role in getting people in homes. Secretary Carson, in your opinion, what's the biggest factor that has caused the credit box to shrink, and what is HUD doing to combat it?
Fear, I think, risk, fear of risk, and looking at things that have happened historically. What are we doing about it? We're trying to expand the number of people who give credit by alleviating some of their anxiety. I just mentioned what we were doing with the False Claims Act,
right,
so that we can bring more people who can provide credit into the market.
Are you seeing a shift?
I think it's starting to shift, absolutely. It's going to take a while, you know, for people to trust what's going on, but they will see over the course of time that we're consistent.
Thank you. And also, I was hoping to ask you about a specific extension of credit and expand. You've started to talk about this, and I guess just one level down on the Federal Housing Authority loans, right, which you've covered. In your testimony specifically, you said that you've noticed a greater number of borrowers looking for FHA loans with higher debt and lower credit scores, and HUD is using closer scrutiny before issuing these mortgages to mitigate risk. How is HUD currently working to strike a balance between promoting access to credit via FHA loans and managing risk?
Well, we're trying to look at data and using that rather than just using, you know, ideology when it comes to issuing credit. You know, that really comes back from my days in medicine, where evidence made a lot of difference. And that's the difference between the fact that at the last turn of the century, before 2000, the average age of death was in the 50s. And at 2000, it was approaching 80s. The main difference is that the medical profession began to use evidence in their policy, and it made a huge difference in our longevity.
And when you said closer scrutiny in your testimony, is that using the data? How are we using the data differently? How's that process changed, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, you look at things you look at best practices. You look at things that have worked in some areas, and you say, why is that working? You try to dissect that out, and then you see if you can make that more broadly applicable.
Great, and thank you very much for your time today. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gooden, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Secretary Carson. Is there anything you haven't talked about today you'd like to discuss?
Oh boy, that opens up a big box. But I will tell you the thing that I am most concerned about is the affordability of housing. You know, we have more than 8 million families in the United States who pay more than 50% of their income for housing. And, you know, we need to really focus a lot of attention on that and get this problem solved.
Do you think spending more money will solve that problem?
Spending more money is not the solution. Again, getting to the etiology of the price increases and what can we do that will enable us to build more housing, that more affordable housing.
Several of my colleagues have mentioned you've been inaccessible. Have you met with leadership of this committee and with my colleagues across the aisle to discuss their ideas?
I have tried. The chairwoman has not had time to meet with me, but I've met with several other members, and we've made some good progress.
Well, I would encourage those discussions to continue, and I thank you for your work and the hard work you've done at your organization and for what's to come. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Virginia, Ms. Wexton, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Secretary Carson, for joining us here today. As you may be aware, the House last week passed the Equality Act, which includes a lot of broad protections for the LGBTQ community, but for our purposes, one of the things I'm most pleased about is that we are explicitly including the LGBTQ community as a part of the Fair Housing Act's non-discrimination protections. Do you agree with this inclusion?
Well, I certainly agree with non-discrimination and with being fair to every single individual in our society.
So you would approve of the inclusion of LGBTQ community as a part of the Fair Housing Act's protections, explicitly protecting them from discrimination in housing?
If you want to include them as one of the protected classes, I think that is something that Congress will be responsible for.
Very good. And I guess one of your responsibilities would have to do with the rulemaking and the rules for HUD and inclusion within HUD. Is that correct?
And our responsibility is to make sure everybody is treated fairly.
And in March 2017, your agency removed links to key resource documents informing emergency shelters on best practices for serving transgender people facing homelessness, and you withdrew a proposed policy that would have required HUD-funded emergency shelters to post notice to residents to inform them of their rights to be free of anti-LGBTQ discrimination under HUD regulations, right?
We are creating a situation where there is more local jurisdictional control.
But you removed that guidance from the site, and it has not been replaced.
That's correct.
Okay. And last month, while you were testifying before the House Appropriations Subcommittee about HUD's withdrawal of these guidance documents, you said that they were not needed and that the equal access rule was in place. Is that correct?
The rules from 2012 and 2016 adequately provide for fairness for all communities.
So those rules are still in place?
Yes, they have not been removed.
Okay, and you also stated we have not made any attempt to change them. Is that correct?
We have not changed any of the rules.
And that was the case when you testified in appropriations. Is that still the case today?
It's still the case today.
Okay. And can you assure this committee that you will not make any, that HUD does not have any current or future plans to eliminate the equal access rule in rulemaking?
I'm not going to say what we will do in the future about anything. We don't know what we're going to do in the future.
Are you currently anticipating doing that?
I'm not currently anticipating changing the rule.
Well, what has your agency done to ensure that the equal access rule is implemented and that recipients of HUD funding are aware of their responsibilities under the equal access rule?
We have left the rules up from 2012 and 2016, and we have made it very clear that we will continue to enforce fairness for everyone. And when something is brought to our attention that is not fair, we will deal with it.
So you're not being proactive, you're just going to be reactive on this issue?
We are being very proactive in terms of making sure that discrimination is not occurring.
But
As
Secretary
I told
Carson, you just testified that you took down the guidance, right? It has not
The guidance was not necessary. The guidance was providing a lot of regulatory input, federal thumb on everything, as opposed to allowing local jurisdictions to make their rules based on the 2012 and the 2016.
So you don't think it's appropriate for HUD to do that at the national level?
Not on that issue, no.
Okay. So you have removed the guidance. You testified that you have no plans to eliminate the equal access rule, but you're also not proactively enforcing it. You're waiting for complaints to filter their way up to HUD, and then you'll deal with it. Is that what you're saying?
No, one of the things that I'm saying is if you want to do something different about the definition of gender, that is a congressional duty.
Thank you. I have no further questions. I'll yield back.
The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Rickleman, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman and Ranking Member McHenry. Secretary Carson, I appreciate you taking the time to answer all of our questions today. Having escaped poverty and lived in public housing, you certainly bring an important perspective to many of the housing challenges we're facing today, and we are grateful to have you here. In your June 28 testimony before the Financial Services Committee, you mentioned the issue of the FHA having to deal with what you called very archaic IT. Just last Thursday, HUD received a Federal Information Technology Innovation Award for advancements in data analytics digital transformation, which I'm a little bit familiar with.
Thank you.
Could you expound on some of the things HUD has been working on over the last year to modernize old IT systems? And secondly, in your opinion, what specific things still need to be done in order to bring HUD's IT programs up to date?
Well, you know, still a lot of our platforms are 40 years old, so technology's been left behind. But what we have done is been able to create a dashboard that gives us real-time information about where our grant money is and how it's being spent. And this allows us to provide more flexibility to the various jurisdictions. So that's something that I'm very excited about. In FHA, you know, thanks to Congress, we've been able to at least start updating, you know, our information technology platforms. It's going to take, you know, quite a bit more, and but we're getting there, and that's the important thing, because, you know, we don't want to fall behind all the other servicers, and that puts a lot of taxpayer money at risk, but it also makes us inefficient, and that's something that we want to change as quickly as possible.
Thank you, because I think 40 years ago I was playing Pong, so I'm glad that there, you see there's some advancements going on here. So thank you for that. And another topic I would like to address are opportunity zones, and the reason there is because I have the biggest district in Virginia. It's actually bigger than 6 states. It's bigger than New Jersey. And we have the most, even though we have one of the 11 districts, I think we have 18% of the opportunity zones throughout the entire state. They were created under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 to stimulate economic growth and job creation. Could you discuss some of the things HUD is doing to incentivize, as far as incentivizing economic growth in low-income communities through opportunity zones? And do you see the criteria for designating opportunity zones changing or expanding in the future?
Yeah, you know, we're providing preference points for people who are willing to go into opportunity zones. And, you know, you can buy something there, you can build something there, you can invest in something there. There are a number of mechanisms that you can utilize. We're also providing expertise, people who can help people create programs that will attract other resources into the area, and ways to partner with entities that already exist within the opportunity zone.
And as everybody knows already, I'm very supportive of opportunity zones, especially with the 5th District of Virginia having so many. And we don't have a lot of time, but I think I have one more question here. And I thank you again very much for answering these questions. Over the last several years, we've seen a dramatic increase in natural disasters. In my district particularly, we've been affected by multiple hurricanes and flooding. In your opinion, how would you rate HUD's response to the most recent disasters?
Well, we've had an unprecedented number of disasters since I became the HUD secretary. I hope I haven't caused them, but the fact of the matter is, I think the response has been good. I'm never satisfied with it. That's why I'm always asking, is there something else we can be doing to get these funds out faster? But do recognize that HUD is the long-term entity when it comes to a disaster. SBA, FEMA, Army Corps of Engineers, those are the short-term responders. Having said that, I still want to speed the process up. So the whole concept of codification in certain arenas is a good concept. Taking out unnecessary steps, a very good concept. And I would personally like to get it down to, you have a disaster, 6 months, you've got everything you need.
Thank you, Secretary Carson, very much, and I yield my time.
Okay.
The gentlewoman from California, Ms. Porter, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Mr. Carson. Are you in favor or opposed to adjusting the interest curtailment penalty schedule for FHA loans that are in default?
I don't know that I can say broadly. I think you.
Well, I'm asking you to state specifically.
I think you got to look at specific cases. In some cases, I might be in favor of it. In some cases, I might not.
Okay. Do you know what the interest rate curtailment schedule is at FHA and how it's different from the GSEs?
Well, we tend to try to maintain a lower interest rate at FHA.
I'm not asking you about the interest rate, sir. I'm asking you about debenture interest curtailment penalties.
Explain.
So, all right, so FHA uses different servicing and conveyance procedures than the GSEs do. And the result of this is that the cost of servicing, mortgage servicing at FHA for a non-performing mortgage is 3 times the cost of doing the equivalent servicing at the GSEs for a non-performing loan. That tripling of cost in servicing, which then has the effect of reducing the credit availability to the American people, because when you drive up servicing costs, then servicers overlay with cost overlays, and it makes the loans more expensive for the very homeowners that FHA is designed to serve. So my question I'm trying to drive at here is, why is FHA, to use a term that I think we can both understand, lousy at servicing mortgages?
Okay, I have not had any discussions about that particular issue, but I will look it up, find out what's going on.
So as you look it up, I'd also like you to get back to me, if you don't mind, to explain the disparity in REO rates. Do you know what an REO is?
An Oreo?
No, not an Oreo, an REO, REO.
Real estate?
What's the O stand for?
Organization?
Owned, real estate owned. That's what happens when a property goes to foreclosure. We call it an REO. And FHA loans have much higher REOs. That is, they go to foreclosure rather than to loss mitigation or to non-foreclosure alternatives like short sales than comparable loans at the GSEs. So I'd like to know why we're having more foreclosures that end in people losing their homes with stains to their credit and disruption to their communities and their neighborhoods at FHA than we are at the GSEs.
I would be extremely happy if you'd like to have you work with the people who do that.
Well, Mr. Carson, respectfully, that was my day job before I came to Congress. So now it's my job to ask you to work with the people.
I'm talking about the people at HUD who do that.
I've spent a decade working with the people at HUD on this problem. So what I would like you to do is to take this back to FHA and to ask the folks at FHA, because since 2007, I have been writing about the problems in FHA's servicing. I am a huge fan of FHA. I am a believer in their mission, and I am a champion for them. Are you?
Of course, I believe in the mission of FHA.
Are you a champion for the institution, the organization?
Very much so.
Okay, so let me make sure you understand. When a loan, the most common outcome for an FHA loan that goes into default is REO. There's a conveyance process. Are you familiar with this?
I know about the conveyance.
All right, so let me ask you about conveyance. What actions is HUD taking to change the conveyance process at FHA to address the loss recovery differential between FHA loans and GSE loans?
Well, again, you're getting way down in the weeds here. And
Yeah, because it's real American people are out of their houses, so they are literally in the weeds when they are foreclosed on.
Understood. And I'm very happy to put you in contact with the people who deal with that. If I got down in the weeds on every issue, I wouldn't get very far.
Okay, appreciate it, but this has been a problem for years. The Urban Institute issued a major report on this, and I will be happy to send you a copy.
I appreciate you bringing it to my attention.
I want to make sure let me ask you this. Given these problems, the outcome is that FHA is the leading cause of blighted homes in the United States. What can you do about that? Do you understand the relationship between the blight and the servicing problems?
Well, I understand that blight is a huge problem and that
it comes from your agency's inaction on servicing.
I'm not sure that I'm willing to accept that FHA is the cause of all the blight that we have.
I hope you feel differently after you read the report. Thank you.
Gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Garcia, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Secretary Carson, thank you for being here with us today and engaging us in conversations about HUD. I want to begin with a proposal pending before this committee, known as the Safe Housing and Families Act. It recognizes and seeks to take action in the aftermath of 13 deaths that have occurred in federally subsidized housing since 2003, including as recently as February when Anthony and Gwendolyn Fleming died of carbon monoxide poisoning at Hickory Hollow Cooperative, a HUD-subsidized housing complex in Wayne, Michigan, near to your childhood home. The Flemings' death were the third and fourth deaths to occur this year. Since April, as you know, HUD has been developing a rule to put an end to these preventable deaths by requiring CO2 detectors in public housing, but it could be many months before that rule is finalized as the process goes. On Friday, a story ran on NBC News website in which a HUD spokesperson is quoted as saying, quote, "Congress can fix this by passing legislation requiring carbon monoxide detectors for those living in HUD housing units where detectors are needed." Secretary Carson, that legislation is before this committee today. This is that public hearing. The Safe Housing for Families Act would codify the rules so that you are developing into law and would provide $10 million in funding over 10 years to carry out the objective of stopping avoidable deaths like the ones I mentioned. This is double the amount that HUD announced yesterday would be made available. Secretary Carson, would you support the Safe Housing for Families Act?
As I've mentioned to you in the past, I am 100% for getting this carbon monoxide issue settled, and I appreciate your help in helping getting that done. And as quickly as we can get it done, it's going to get done.
Great. Thank you, Secretary. I accept your endorsement. Changing gears and returning back to a topic we were discussing previously, the mixed status rule, I'd like to share with you a story about Joyce Bell. She was raised in Chicago and has always struggled to have clean, green, safe, and affordable housing. She's experienced homelessness, and when not homeless, rented from slumlords. A landlord broke into her home and turned off her electrical services. She's lived in buildings that were foreclosed, then taken over by banks, and in homes with dangerous conditions. She's been on the waiting list at the Chicago Housing Authority for over 5 years. There's an estimated shortfall of about 3.6 million affordable rental homes in this country, and every day that HUD doesn't have the resources to fill that shortfall, Joyce and many people like her suffer. According to your agency's own analysis, implementing replacing mixed status families under your proposal will increase the federal costs of subsidizing units. Can you explain to Joyce why she should remain on the waiting list so that HUD can pay more money to implement a rule it acknowledges is unnecessary?
Well, the people who are on the waiting list tend to have even greater needs than the ones who are not on the waiting list, which sort of bolsters the point that those are the people who perhaps should be getting the housing assistance. But I want to re-emphasize the point that what we are doing is following the law of the land. When we begin to pick and choose which laws we're going to enforce, I think we lead to chaos. And if Congress doesn't like the rule, they have the power to change it.
Well, thank you for that. Let me finish with this, Secretary. HUD's regulatory impact analysis states that, quote, perhaps the likeliest scenario would be that HUD would have to reduce the quantity and quality of assisted housing in response to higher costs. I think my colleague will do some follow-up questions on that. So when you claim that evicting eligible children from their homes will free up space for those on the waiting list like Joyce, that simply isn't true. It's not consistent with what your staff analysis, career staff at HUD have concluded.
Again, what they've concluded is that the reason that the cost would be higher is because the people are more needy who are on the waiting list.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
The gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Garcia, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And first, I'd like to say that both to our witness and in fact, even to a couple of members from both sides of the aisle, that I have found the word illegal to be very offensive, and I wish that more people would just stop using that word. As someone who has deeply held religious beliefs that we are all God's children, I also have a firm belief that no human being is illegal. So, Madam Chair, I would hope that in the future we would discourage any testimony or any reference to that term. It's offensive, and it's something that should just be, quite frankly, stricken from the record. In line with that, I do want to follow up, Mr. Secretary, some questions in the exchange that you had both with Mr. Williams and Mr. Vargas. Could you just make it clear for the record with a yes or no that right now, as the law stands, non-citizens are not eligible for public housing?
People who are not here legally. There's a difference between a non-citizen.
Sir, the question is non-citizens.
There are some non-citizens who are eligible.
There are some?
Yes.
Could you tell me which program, please?
If you are in the United States legally, then you're not a citizen, then you're a non-citizen, but that doesn't make you illegal.
Right, because to me, sir, it is really difficult for anyone in the capacity of a housing authority official to determine who is here authorized or unauthorized. There is so many different categories of immigration law that I frankly do not see how anybody would be able to determine at that level whether someone is here legal or illegal. But the point is really not about the legal or illegal. The point is that they shouldn't even be called illegal. They're either here unauthorized. There are so many people that are brought here against their will, whether through human trafficking, through drug cartels. They may have just had an expiration of their visa. But again, that underscores my point. There's just no way for someone to determine at a housing authority level that anyone is illegal. Because in fact, isn't it true that you prorate the rent now?
It is true that you cannot prorate a roof over somebody's head.
That's not the question I'm asking,
so
sir. Do you not prorate the rent, that if there's someone there that you think is unauthorized, that person does not get that portion of the rent?
The concept of prorating makes no sense in this context.
But sir, the question is, isn't that in fact the process that you use now?
You may call it prorating, but it doesn't make any sense, and that's not what it does.
Well, what do you call it, sir?
I call it giving aid and assistance to people who are here illegally.
Well, it's interesting to me because your staff seems to call it prorating and everybody else does it. Let's go on to another point about costs. Are you going to be able to reimburse all these housing authorities if this rule were put in place for the millions of dollars it's going to cost to evict these children?
You know, what fascinates me is how you can be so interested in the symptoms without wanting to get to the root cause of the
Sir, I'm the one asking the questions with all due respect. There is about a $13 million cost that I've come across. It's an estimate, only an estimate in any of these evictions. Is HUD going to provide any funding for the local authorities if this rule is put in place?
All of HUD's current programs are in place.
All right, so you're going to shift 55,000 children from being with their families to a homeless status. What's going to happen with these children? Have you thought this program through?
Well, maybe what will happen with them is that you and Congress will do your job and solve the problem.
Well, sir, it is your problem now, and it is your solution to try to do this make status rule. I'm asking if you've thought this through. Again, this administration is attempting to separate children. Are you going to keep track of them? Are you going to be able to put them somewhere? Or will they just be on the streets as little urchins?
Well, as I mentioned multiple times, they have a 6-month deferral that can be requested, that can be renewed 2 times, which gives you 18 months.
So I take it you have no plans of how you're going to handle this?
They have 18 months, which is enough time for Congress to engage in what is needed to be done to solve the problem.
Well, sir, I think it's your responsibility because it's your rule, and I would hope that this separation of children policy would be a little bit better thought through, because the last one has been a total disaster at the border. Moving on real quickly, I'm concerned that you all have HUD regulations that tell projects what they must have to make a home environmentally sound, you know, hot water, cold water, heating. But in the South, like in Texas and Houston, it is really extremely hot, but it does not include air conditioning. Why is air conditioning not as important as heating in New York?
I think air conditioning is very important.
So why is it not included?
It is in the process of being worked on right now.
Well, please keep me posted on that, sir. Thank you.
The gentlewoman from Massachusetts, Ms. Presley, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Over here. Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Carson and I have waited a long time for this moment, but the residents of my district, the 7th Congressional in Massachusetts, have been waiting far longer for your agency to do its job. Colleagues across the aisle earlier were critical of the passion and even the outrage that we've expressed on this side of the aisle. I make no apologies for that. This matter is very, very personal. Let me be clear, housing is a fundamental human right, and the displacement of families should be regarded as the public health crisis that it is. Mr. Secretary, your pioneering work in pediatric neurology is historic, and it is something to be commended. And so it pains me that your gifted hands and mind are doing the bidding and carrying the water of what I believe to be one of the most morally bankrupt presidents in our nation's history, increasing rents, evicting families. You mentioned that the operating room was a safe haven away from all the troubles of the world. Safe haven, that's exactly what a home should be and what every single person, and in particular our children, deserve. Today, you are not here as a doctor or even as our Surgeon General, which I think might be better suited for your talents, but as the official tasked with leading the agency overseeing our nation's crumbling housing stock. And for that, I do believe you are unqualified. You said this was not a political matter, but it does seem that political views are being played out in the policies that are being rolled out every single day. When you imply that people are living in public housing either because of a desire to be self-sufficient, questioning a work ethic, when we are eliminating a stock but not increasing supply, people in the Massachusetts 7th Congressional District would have to work 84 hours to afford a decent 1-bedroom at fair market rent. Doris Bunty, who's a former Massachusetts state representative in my district and was the first African-American woman to hold the position of head of BHA, the first public housing tenant to lead a public housing agency in a major city. She said being poor is not a character flaw. I agree. But again, given your medical background, perhaps you could weigh in on the health consequences of failing to invest in safe housing. Mr. Secretary, since I am short on time here, yes or no, is stable and safe housing a social determinant of health?
Sounds like you have not been here and heard most of my testimony.
Please just answer the question, reclaiming my time. Yes or no, is stable and safe housing a social determinant of health?
There is no question that housing is an important part of health.
Yes or no?
No question that it's a part of health.
It is well documented that health problems such as lead poisoning, asthma, and injuries from trips and falls, especially amongst our senior population, can be linked to substandard housing conditions. Combined, these conditions result in billions a year in healthcare costs. Many of those most at risk of developing these conditions reside in public and federally assisted housing. Yes or no? If left unaddressed, do you believe the substandard public housing conditions pose a risk to tenants' physical, mental, and emotional health? If left unaddressed.
Yes or no? Can you ask me some questions yourself?
You don't get to
Stop
dictate what
reading
my
this
line
other
of
stuff?
questioning is, reclaiming my time. You're a very smart
You can
man,
reclaim
so
it all
you
you want.
understand the question. Please answer it. Yes or no, if left unaddressed, which I believe they are unaddressed because this budget does not reflect the need, do you believe the substandard public housing conditions pose a risk to tenants' physical, mental, and emotional health?
You already know the answer to that.
Yes or no?
You know the answer.
Yes or no? I know the answer. Do you know the answer? Yes or no?
Reclaiming my time.
You don't get to do that.
The time belongs to the gentlelady.
The evidence is clear that if we do not invest the necessary funds today, we will pay the price in people's health tomorrow. And what is this administration's response? Cuts. Cuts to crucial funding like the Public Housing Operating Fund and the Family Self-Sufficiency Program, Section 202 housing for elderly and Section 811, housing for persons with disabilities, and even the complete elimination of the Public Housing Capital Fund. These policies are devoid of empathy and humanity, and you've been talking in the abstract, but I want to get specific. There's a Miss Northcross, a mother and a grandmother living in Brighton in my district. She's raised her children and now cares for her grandchildren in property with thick mold on the walls. Her son was recently hospitalized, look at the pictures here, because of bone tumors in his arm and leg. He needs surgery to save and improve his quality of life, but he won't get it because the family must have a sanitary, stable housing condition first. Their actual home literally poses a risk of post-op injury and infection. Her question to you is, what do they become? When you raise children in these conditions, what can they become? So yes or no? Do Ms. Norcross and her family deserve to live in these conditions because they are poor?
If you've listened to any...
Yes or no, do
that I
they
have
deserve to live in
say,
these conditions because they are
You
poor?
know very well...
Would you let your grandmother live in public housing?
You know very well...
Would you let your
my
grandmother
view
live in
on
public
this.
housing, yes or no?
You know very well...
Under your watch and at your helm, would you allow your grandmother to live in public housing under these conditions?
It would be very nice if you would stop acting...
You've stated that
The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Lawson, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's a great day in America. Doctor, welcome to the committee. When I was 5 years old, we lost everything, house, everything, and moved a number of times. And 6 in the family. And my father had to recover, and eventually, you know, we built a house. And I still own that house today after they are gone. So I do believe is that if people work hard enough, you know, and they want to survive, they can survive, sometimes without the government help, because there was no government help then. But one of the things that I would like to do, as you said earlier in your testimony, and I lived in all kind of conditions, you know, is to ask for the help from your department and to develop housing IRAs. And I'm gonna give you a chance to respond to that. And what I mean by that is to try to see if we can move people out of public housing into home ownership. And maybe a certain portion of the rent might go into the deferred account, where eventually they can get enough money to get a down payment and be able to live in a home. The other thing is, with all the millennials that we have now, is also to develop affordable, deductible, tax-deferred IRAs. So as they're renting all of this time, that they can also set aside funds on a tax-deferred basis, so they at one point be able to have home ownership. You know, and I really appreciate the opportunity when you came down to Jacksonville with Senator Rubio and myself to meet at Eureka Gardens on the condition that we had down there with these management companies and so forth, which caused a lot of problems in a lot of public housing and kind of hard to regulate. So, but those IRA, I've been working on some legislation on that, probably have a long ways to go to get the concept accepted, but I think it's something that we can move forward with, is to move people, and I'm gonna stop right now where you can talk before my time run out.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the work that you've done on behalf of the people who, particularly in the Jacksonville area, were suffering very significantly. And that's what we should be doing, looking for ways to get those people into a different type of environment. And really, that's what this is all about. You know, it's not about ideology and, you know, who's evil and who's bad. It's about the people themselves. And when we can actually focus on them, that's how we're actually able to solve the problems. That's why I was able to come to an agreement with Mayor de Blasio in New York, even though we have very different views on things, by focusing on the people. And that's always going to be the solution for the problems that we have here.
How do you feel about the deferred IRA for housing?
I think this is a very excellent idea, and we're trying to find better ways to expand that family self-sufficiency program. One of the ways that I've been talking about and suggesting is that people be able to take part of their monthly subsidy, put it into an escrow, and that is used specifically for the maintenance of their apartment. If they don't have a lot of maintenance, it just continues to grow. And then if they leave public housing within a certain period of time, they get all of that money that has accumulated and can use it for a down payment, because there are a lot of people who can keep their head above water, but they never will be able to accumulate a down payment. And that, as I said earlier, is the key method of wealth accumulation in this country, is home ownership.
And I want to thank you for all your hard work, and I would like for your agency to work with us to try to see if we can craft some legislation to bring before Congress, because I think this is a key what we can do going
Love to work with you on that.
Okay, thank you very much, Madam Chair. At that, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Phillips, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and welcome, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you.
One day in the distant future, when you look back and reflect on your work at HUD, what do you want your legacy to be?
Well, you know, I'm frequently asked about my legacy, and to be honest with you, I'm not a legacy person, but I would very much like to see the organization turn from one that just takes care of people to one that sets people on a trajectory of success.
Okay. And in general terms, your philosophy relative to the role of our federal government in providing housing to the least advantaged in the country?
Well, I think we definitely have a responsibility to take care of those who cannot take care of themselves. So, you know, the elderly, the disabled, who, you know, simply aren't able to do anything. But I think we have a responsibility to help those who are work able to get on a trajectory of success where they begin to believe in themselves. And as I said before, most important resource that we have in this country is our people. And we only have 330 million people. It's not a lot of people compared to China that has 4 times that many, and India with 4 times that many. We have to compete against them. We will never be able to compete with them in the future if we don't concentrate on developing our people.
I would agree. And if I gave you a magic wand right now and you could wave it and affect one policy change that you think would lead us to that end, what might it be?
If I could do one thing with a magic wand, I would make this country stop hating each other.
You're here. I would join you.
We
with
get
that.
a whole lot done.
I'll share the wand with you. I do have a question about mortgage insurance premiums. And as you know, this is before you became secretary, but the Trump administration suspended the proposed decrease by a quarter point in the premium rate. And I'm just curious, have you considered that and your thoughts on it and why this indefinite suspension continues?
Well, certainly when I first came, there was a lot of pressure to lower the premium by 25 basis points, and they said more people would be able to get, mortgage guarantees. But if we had done that, we would have ended up with less than 2% of the rate capital ratio that is required by Congress. It would have ended up at 1.7%. Now we're in a reasonable shape, but we still have to be very careful because we have a lot of things that impinge upon the mutual mortgage insurance fund. So, it's done on a day-by-day, week-by-week, month-by-month basis, looking at the risk and making adjustments as necessary.
Okay, so prospectively a chance that it could be reduced?
Always,
okay.
Absolutely.
I hear votes. My last question is your position on establishing parity on mortgage insurance with the private market. Your thoughts?
With the private market?
Mm-hmm.
We want to bring as much private equity into the system as we possibly can. Obviously, we need to have government backstops in order to provide confidence in the market. But we need to enact policies that encourage private capital to come in.
Agreed. And your thoughts relative to the 78% threshold that when reached, no longer requires mortgage insurance in the private market, vis-a-vis FHA?
I can understand why people come up with numbers like that. I think, again, we have to look at the risk that are involved and what are the risks that we're looking to mitigate against. And is there a one-size-that-fits-all model where 78% is the magic number? I'm not sure that there is.
What number might you select if you could choose one?
I think it depends on the circumstances.
Okay. All right. Thank you, sir. Okay. I yield back.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Secretary Carson for his time today. The conversation that we had earlier about taking a break is not necessary now. We're going to go to our classified briefing, and there's no need for you to remain. So without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions to the chair, which will be forwarded to the Secretary for his response. I ask the Secretary to please respond as promptly as you are able. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. And with that, this hearing is adjourned. Thank you.